Japanimation Station.
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I am Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to dive into the wild and wacky world of anime for Season 2 of Japanimation Station. That's right, we are back for our second season, where we are going to be taking a look at a topic that I have been very excited to talk about for a very long time. We are calling this season Ufotable Moon Works because we are talking about the Ufotable adaptations of the Type Moon projects Kata no Kyoukai. We're talking about the movies, and then we'll be talking about Fate Zero and Fate Stay Night Unlimited Blade Works and the Fate Stay Night Heaven's Feel movie trilogy. These are all things that I have loved for a very, very long time now, and we're getting to explore it, Jonathan, together for this podcast, and I'm very excited.
And getting back to the early days of Weekly Suit Gundam, where you are a grizzled pro at these things, and you know all about them, and I know absolutely nothing. Just like with, Gundam back in the day, I hadn't seen a second of Gundam. I knew there were big robots. That was about it. And then I, watched the first episode, and a little girl's family gets blown up 5 feet from her, and I'm like, wow, this is crazy. And same with this stuff, because we are starting out today with the Garden of Sinners, Kara no Kyoukai. And I know nothing about it. I know nothing about this. I know nothing about Fate Stay Night. I know nothing about any of these things. I know about Ufotable, because I've seen Kimetsu no Yaiba, and it's great. But I don't know anything about these. So I was sufficiently confused by the first couple episodes of Kara no Kyoukai, which you'll tell us what we're talking about in a second here, but also quite thrilled because they're very interesting. So this is truly veteran and newbie, once again, the positions back in their rightful place to the initial sort of premise of Weekly Suit Gundam, now here on Japanimation Station.
Yeah, and it's interesting for me because I feel like I have the same feeling sitting down to record this podcast that I had when we record Weekly Suit Gundam #1, which is like, I have no idea what your take is at all, right? Because it's because that was after we did the first episode of Weekly Suit Gundam. I was like, okay, Jonathan's into this stuff. Whereas I have no idea what your take is, what you know about this, what you don't know, or sort of where you're coming away from it with. But yeah, so to talk about what we're watching on this episode specifically, just to be clear, we're talking about the first two movies of Kata no Kyoukai, or The Garden of Sinners, which is its official English title. That official English title comes from the Japanese side. That is in no way a translation of the Japanese title. It's kind of almost a stylistic thing in the original Japanese title that then is automatically assumed. It's almost like Attack on Titan or something with Shingeki no Kyojin for when it comes over here. Kata no Kyoukai, for people who want to know what the Japanese title means, this basically means on the boundary of emptiness, or on the boundary of nothingness, which is a more, I think, thematically appropriate title than The Garden of Sinners. I think Garden of Sinners just sounds very cool, and so that's why they kind of went with it. But yes, we're watching the first two movies, and we'll be going over, today we'll probably have a longer history section than we usually have, because we're talking about both what is Type Moon and where does that come from, and we'll be doing some history stuff for Ufotable. And I originally had the idea of that we would just do the first movie because I thought it would be fucking hilarious to see how would you, Jonathan, even talk about only having seen the first one, because the first one gives you no context for anything at all. But then I quickly realized that would probably make for a very bad podcast, even if it would be very funny to me. So I decided we should do the first two movies together.
I actually think it would have worked. I was frankly more confused after the second one than after the first one. I will be perfectly frank. That is not a statement of quality. I'll give that later. But I was, in terms of like what is going on in this world, more confused after the second than the first. But they're both very interesting. But no, I am excited for it. I'm excited to hear the whole history section here and to talk about these first two films in Garden of Sinners, Kara no Kyoukai. It's going to be a good one. And we're going to be doing these basically two at a time, other than episode 5 and 7, I think, because those are both 2 hours long.
Yeah, so we'll be doing movies 1 and 2 together. We'll be doing 3 and 4 together. 5 on its own because it's 2 hours long. 6 on its own, or no, because it's 5.
I guess we are doing 6 and 7 together.
Yeah, we're doing 6 and 7 together. 7 is a 2 hour long one, but I think we can, because I think 6 not a lot happens in 6 if I remember correctly. Or at least not enough to like be its own episode. And then
I was
8
thrown off because we're doing
be
a wrap up with like the epilogue and the other movie, and
yeah. Then 8 is going to be, which is kind of on its own anyways, because it was made after all the other movies that were made all in a row. And then with 8, we'll be doing all the extra stuff because there are a bunch of like shorts and OVAs that they did, and we're just going to throw those in there, like extra chorus, that kind of stuff will be in that episode. Yes, so that's kind of how we're packaging all this stuff. Do you have any like top level takes, Jonathan, you want to do before we get into history stuff?
It's an extremely striking production. I mean, this is 2007, right, for these two episodes?
Yes.
And it's kind of funny. I would look at this and go, oh, some of this like use of CGI or whatever, I'm like, oh man, they've come a long way since this for Ufotable. And then I thought, wait, this is 2007. This is bonkers fucking nuts that this looks like this in 2007 compared to the rest of the anime industry, right? Like, what they're doing here, I think people were catching up to in like 2015, 6, like whatever, pick your number. So Ufotable, ahead of the curve on that. Amazing music, stupendous voice acting. I was amused at how much the first episode made me think of Persona 3, right down to near the end realizing, oh, that's the voice of Aigis as Shiki.
Oh, yes. Yes.
All these sorts of things, to the point where I actually wanted to ask you, were these novels influential on Persona 3? Because
Probably.
There's so many similarities in these first couple. But anyway, yeah, I liked it. I think the first episode is fantastic. I think or first movie. I'm going to say episode, but I mean movie.
They're kind of episodes. Like, it's almost like Unicorn Gundam or something, where these were released in theaters, but it's like they're designed as like these are kind of mega episodes of a big TV show. That's kind of how they were produced. Right. Like the directors for each movie is a little bit more akin to like an episode director on an anime show than it is like a director of an anime film that you would normally think of, like a Hayao Miyazaki role. Like it's a little bit like the production is distributed like a TV show, just with very big, high like production value individual episodes.
Right, because these didn't come out on like a movie calendar where there were years between them or anything, right? So yeah, no, I thought the first one was fantastic. I mean, I was obviously confused because it gives you no context, but I think it gives you an amazing sense of atmosphere and emotional context, and I think it tells like a whole story in a way that if there were no more after that first episode, I would be like confused but also like satisfied with it as a piece of art. The second one is more clearly like set up for, because literally it goes back 3 years in the timeline.
Yes.
It's the beginning, and is setting up a lot of character dynamics and doesn't really resolve itself at the end. I mean, literally, this is called part 1 of a 2-part story that, like, part 2 is episode 7 or something. It's hilarious. So, like, it literally, leaves you hanging in that sense. And I was honestly a little more like, when I say confused, that's not a bad thing. I just mean I got to the end of that second episode and I was even more like, okay, I really want to know what this world is, like, what's going on. Because the first episode does have a self-contained story with a supernatural investigation that resolves itself. This second one, obviously, the investigation involves the nature of whatever Shiki is, and you don't find that out. Still very striking. I did not feel the same sense of, like, on its own, just as a 1-hour piece of art, this is as amazing, but I'm very excited to see more of it. If we weren't doing this podcast in the morning, I would have continued and watched episode 3. I was very into it. Both of these flew by. They're incredible.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I ultimately went away from just doing the first movie on its own is almost less to like, because it would have been confusing for you. It would have been like, I don't know how I would talk about it without spoiling things. Like, it's just like, because the first movie gives you so little of the context of the characters in the world, because all of that is in the second movie, that was like, how would I ever say anything about this without inevitably giving stuff away in talking about it? Which I think is still going to be hard, but at least like we have like, oh, we know who the two main characters are and how they met is a thing you know by the second movie, you know?
Well, I would have assumed coming out of the first one that Shiki is a robot of some sort. Like, literally,
Right.
I would have thought they are some kind of, like, created being, almost akin to Aigis, same voice actress, which obviously colors my thinking a little bit. But then, episode 2, this person is a weird human, but a human. So, like, I have more of a sense of what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah. But yes, and I'll also say that most of the episodes are more like episode 1 in the sense that it is generally self-contained stories. Like, there's a very specific reason why there's only 2 of them that are called Part 1 and Part 2. And the rest of them are more structured the way the first one is. But yes, cool. Yeah, and I've watched these before. I love these. I like the whole Type Moon style. Watching it again, it is still like amazing. I just love the mood and tone of it so much. In particular, that first movie, the tone is so thick, and it's like really, it's kind of like a mood piece to me, is what that first movie is, and it's just. I had the same reaction where I watched both of them last night and it just flew by and I was like, fuck, we're going to have to wait. I shouldn't just move on to the next one right away. I should wait and watch it closer to the next time we'll record. But I do just have a powerful urge to keep moving to the next episodes because these are really good. But let's get into the history and talk about kind of what is Kata no Kyoukai? How does it come to be? What the fuck is a Type Moon? We'll talk about some Ufotable stuff in there also. But the Type Moon stuff is probably going to be a bigger focus because it's kind of a more complicated story because it's really a kind of almost like a rags to riches thing of a small group of fans kind of working on their own, building up this little like kind of small, almost like what you'd call like an indie success that then has now exploded into, if you go to modern Type Moon, they have Fate Grand Order, which was for years one of, if not the most successful mobile game in the world. So it's like the meteoric success of Type Moon is very fascinating. The level of impact that their works have had on the anime industry at large, I think, is really immense, particularly once you get to the Ufotable connections. But you said stuff that made comments of like, you see some similarities with Persona 3, and I have no doubt that like a lot of the people, like Hashino, the director for Persona 3, would absolutely have been deeply familiar with the writing of Kinoko Nasu, the main writer at Type Moon, and his style, because his style is incredibly distinctive and has been very, very influential. So let's talk about where all this comes from. Type Moon is kind of like the company that we talk about now. It comes originally from 2 people, primarily Kinoko Nasu, the writer, and his friend Takashi Takeuchi, the artist. Although I think Takeuchi he's more of like the business-minded of the 2 as well. So in most of like, he's the one who actually like created Type Moon and was like the runner of the company notes, which kind of is the holding company or whatever that runs Type Moon. But Nasu is more of like the creative figure at the core of it, writing the stories. They both grew up together in like middle school and high school in Japan. Nasu being a writer and like practicing writing, being a big fan of science fiction and mystery novels in particular. And you see a lot of that mystery stuff, especially in Kata no Kyoukai. Then Takashi Takeuchi being an artist and an illustrator. And they're both in the doujin scene in terms of being consumers of the doujin market. And doujin, for people who do not know, it's spelled D-O-U-J-I-N. It is a Japanese term that is written with the words for like similar and person. And it's an interesting market that's important to talk about with Type Moon, because Type Moon ultimately comes out of this scene. And it's basically like fan-produced and independently published works that could be magazines, they can be manga, they can be novels, they can be games. There's even doujin anime, although that's a little bit harder to do because of the production difficulties in making animation. But it's an interesting area, doujin, because it's in kind of like a gray space between, for an American equivalent market, what we would call something like fan fiction or like fan projects and indie stuff, like independently published, whatever it is, music, so on and so forth, stuff that you release on your own. And we have like a big distinction between those two things in the West, where in Japan, that doujin market that like is a big part of the kind of otaku culture, there's less of a distinction there, and you're able to sell in comic markets or comic-ettes, which are kind of like a Japanese Comic-Con in some ways, fan-made works that have like a fan fiction quality. As long as it's like sold on an individual level, kind of like in person, you are able to do that. And so there's this whole thriving kind of fan and independent creator world that exists in Japan, and that's what the doujin market is. So Nasu and Takeuchi both were consumers of the doujin market. They're like big otakus in school. And Nasu in high school starts writing a project that is a thing that would eventually become much, much later what we now know as Fate Stay Night. But he basically started writing a novel and kind of like sharing it with his friends and stuff like that, and playing with a lot of these different ideas. But for a while, nothing really comes of that. They both graduate high school. They both go off and work in the video game industry in different areas. Nasu more is like a freelancer working as a like background writer for like JRPGs and stuff like that. Takeuchi goes and works for a video game company called Compile, as an artist at that company. And then a really important thing happens in Japan for otaku in 1996. And that is that the first episode of Neon Genesis Evangelion comes out. And Kinoko Nasu watches that first episode of EVA, and his story is that he was immediately inspired to go back and start writing again, and this time really wanted to get something actually published, and submit something for a novel competition in Japan. And so he writes a 400-plus page draft of a thing that is called Mahotsukai no Yoru. This will eventually become, much, much later, a visual novel that actually is the remake of that visual novel comes out in English like early next year. I think it's called Witch of the Holy Night. So it's kind of interesting that's kind of come all the way back around to this. But this original rough draft is a thing that like he only made a couple of copies. He only ever showed it around to a few friends. This original version of this novel never actually was released. The story is that it was so long, he couldn't submit it for a contest, and he couldn't figure out how to cut the length down to make it appropriate to submit for any of the contests, which is very funny to me because it's very appropriate for his writing style. That he's very verbose, which makes it good for visual novels, but maybe not good for these kinds of quick and dirty novel contests you want to submit it to, try to get it published. But Mahotsukai no Yoru is really important because it gives him, he has this like passion now of trying to want to get something actually released, get something out there. And it's also where he experiments with his writing style and really kind of plays with a lot of the character archetypes and themes that you see in his later work. Because all of Nasu's writing has very similar elements that in like ideas that he plays with and modulates. And you will see as we move through Kara no Kyoukai into Fate, you will see how some similar concepts start getting evolved and get pushed into this different area because he is a very iterative writer across the different projects he works on. And a lot of those ideas really starts with Mahotsukai no Yoru. So after 1996, he fails to get that published. But he does have a blog that he starts, and he has Takashi Takeuchi with him on his blog, starting to write illustrations for other writing projects that he is working on. So he works on some other stuff that he's writing. I believe Takeuchi at this time also did create like character designs for the characters of Mahotsukai no Yoru that were on the blog as well. So it's like he's trying to sort of like get it out there, this like these projects in that kind of fan community online. This is the late 90s. So it's this very kind of early internet kind of fan novel thing, web novel that he's working on. One of the big projects that he works on at this point is the original version of Kara no Kyoukai, which he releases in individual chapters on his website. They do 5 chapters basically releasing on that blog for free, again, with Takashi Takeuchi doing illustrations and character designs of like Shiki and stuff like that. They get through those kind of 5 chapters, and that is, you know, it gets a little bit of like a cult hit in a very, very niche market, but it's still extremely unknown. But it is like, that is where Kara no Kyoukai ultimately comes from, is 1998 being released for free in individual chapter segments. To be clear, those chapters are what the movies are. So chapter 1 is movie 1, chapter 2 is movie 2. Like that's what we mean when we say chapters.
So the original work is also in this like out of order chronology
Yes.
and all of that. That's not an Ufotable thing. That's from the original.
No,
novel.
yeah, it is exactly the same structure as the novels. It is the same like non-chronological. We'll talk about when we talk about movie one changes they do make, because I have actually read the first 3 chapters in Japanese. So like I have a little bit of experience with the original versions that we can talk about for that. But in general, it is like a very close adaptation of the structure of the story, and that achronological structure is very intentional and is part of the original release. So in 1998, 1999, he's releasing some of these projects. Again, he's writing like short stories. Like there's other stuff he's doing as well. Kana no Kyoukai is like the most notable thing from that point. And then Takashi Takeuchi gets with a couple of friends, a programmer and a music composer from Compile, and introduces them to Nasu. And together they decide, hey, let's like do something bigger rather than releasing like, here's some drawings and some like, novel stuff and chapters online. Let's make a visual novel. Like, let's form a doujin circle, the circle being like a doujin group, basically. And make a visual novel, a video game, right, for PC that you just like. And at this point, this is like, you're not talking digital distribution, right? You're talking, we're going to make a visual novel. We're going to buy CDs, print it to CDs, go to a comic market and sell them in person. And be a part of like, that is what the doujin scene is at this point, because it is before you have that online distribution element. And they decide to start making this visual novel. Nasu is writing it. Takashi Takeuchi does the art and the character designs. They have the programmer doing the programming. They have the composer doing the music. They think the composer's name is Kate. I don't know if the programmer, I forget what his name is. It was like a pseudonym. I don't know if his like official name ever actually got, or his real name ever got out there. And they start working on a visual novel called Tsukihime, which means literally moon princess. And this is where Type Moon is formed. So the company is, or the group is named after this sort of first project, Tsukihime, that they release. So they make Tsukihime. They release Tsukihime in 2000. And it is for, again, a very, you have to keep in mind, we're talking about a very niche, small level market. So we're not talking about fucking Grand Theft Auto or anything. But for this very niche market of selling in-person doujin visual novels, these novels also are technically adult in content. They don't have a lot of adult content, but they have sex scenes, like explicit sex scenes, because that's part of making a success in this very, very niche marketplace. It's one of the ways that you can kind of market it. And that's the kind of like that sex sells thing. So it was very common at the time, in particular, that you would have these groups trying to make these visual novels, put in some sex scenes, and like put in that kind of dating sim aspect, even if the core of the story really is not about that. It's like 1% of the content of that story. But they make it, they release Tsukihime, and it is, for that niche market, a massive, massive, massive fucking hit. It is easily the best-selling doujin like visual novel of the year that it's released. It is the thing that kind of launches Type Moon's success. The next year, they release a fan disc of Tsukihime that has a bunch of bonus content and stuff like that. And on that fan disc, they also put in some of the other things that they had worked on, including chapters of Kana no Kyoukai. And this is what gets Kana no Kyoukai out there, is not really that original blog release. It's this add-on of like, hey, here's some extra stuff on this extra disc for Tsukihime, this visual novel that everybody loves and everybody's buying in this market. And then now you're kind of learning about Kana no Kyoukai, and that name is getting out there, and that story is starting to get out there. And the Type Moon is working on all these other projects. All of a sudden, they're working with an indie game company or game developer to make Melty Blood, which is a fighting game franchise that is still ongoing in like this weird little circle. They just made a new Melty Blood like last year. That features Tsukihime characters, but in like a fighting game context, again, like in this weird little like kind of indie market. And so they slowly start sort of exploding in this little space in the doujin world. And in 2002, or sorry, like late 2001, they publish Kana no Kyoukai. They finish the last 2 chapters of Kana no Kyoukai, and they sell it as 2 volumes as a doujinshi. And so now that's when the complete version of Kana no Kyoukai is made, is in 2001, and they're selling it in person at comic markets and 2 separate volumes. And so they, again, like you're slowly getting this spread of Type Moon's stuff out there. It's getting more popular, more attention. There is a anime adaptation that Tsukihime made, which is infamously terrible. I've never seen it. The fan base despises it. And Nasu despises it. Like, it was so bad that it almost prevented these movies, Kan no Kyoukai movies, from being made because they were so thrown off by the process of having their stuff be adapted. But having something so niche be adapted into anime in the first place, like, shows how much attention it was getting. And then their second project that they start working on then, they've done their Tsukihime stuff, they're working on a new visual novel. Takeshi Takeuchi has the idea to go to Nasu and say, hey, let's pull out that thing you worked on in high school, this weird little project that you never really finished, and let's like revamp it, turn it into something that can be made into a visual novel. This idea that you were inspired by this like show that was on at the time to have these like heroes and mythological characters and historical figures fighting this battle in modern day Japan. Like, that's a great idea. That's really workable. We should do that. Turn it into something bigger. And then he also had the idea to gender swap the two main characters, which will be really important when we get to Fate's Day Night. And that is what sort of slots everything together. They start working on what would become Fate's Day Night. In that process, they realized how ambitious everything had gotten, and their level of success meant that they could not really do this as a doujin circle, as this like fan group. Like, they were not an official company. They were just like a group of people who met up together and worked on a thing. And so they decide to, in order to be able to get funding so that they could get like, you know, money and survive, and get other people to also work with them and help them on some of the technical aspects of the game. They make a company called Notes, which is technically the company. That's why at like the beginning of Kan no Kyoukai, you have like it's an Aniplex Ufotable Notes production. That's the name of the company. Type Moon is like the name of the brand. And they make Notes, and that is like the company that then puts out Fate's Day Night. And if Tsukihime is a like colossal level success in that really niche market, Fate's Day Night is like an unprecedented level success. It sells hundreds of thousands of copies, which is not a thing that like that market ever really does. It is still one of the best selling visual novels ever made. It's never even been released in English, and that's still true. And it is the thing that like changes the face of what Type Moon is, because it is this massive hit. It gets, you know, an anime adaptation. It gets a PS2 version of the game with full voice acting with the anime cast. It gets all this stuff, so much attention, fighting game spin-offs, like radio dramas, like all kinds of stuff. Like, it creates a whole industry unto itself in its own little marketplace with Fate's Day Night. And that is the thing that then gets all this attention to Type Moon. Around that time, Fate's Day Night comes out late 2004. Around that time in the summer of 2004 is also when Kan no Kyoukai gets officially published by Kodansha as a proper like paperback book that is sold in stores rather than things sold at fan markets. That is the original version of the books. It is sold in 2 volumes. Although, to be clear, when we say 2 volumes, that's kind of like Lord of the Rings or something, where it's the volumes is arbitrary. You know, these are like a set of like individual stories in those chapters. And it's just like the practicalities of not wanting to release like a 1,000-page book. And so that's where Kan no Kyoukai comes in, is officially released in 2004, June 8th in 2004 by Kodansha. And then this is where you now have to talk about Ufotable. So this is where Ufotable comes in. Ufotable is an anime company that started in 2000 from a group of small friends who left their different anime jobs at larger anime companies and came together, and they were like, we want to make our own company that is like, we want to make the company that we want to work at. They're like burned out of working at all these like big kind of publishing houses, and they just want to like do what they want to do. Their company Ufotable is named after an actual piece of furniture called a UFO table. That is like a table shaped like a UFO, like a weird 70s thing. That is like aspirational of like, we want to be a company that can have this like weird funky table, you know, and it's kind of like a name chosen on a whim by Kondo Hikari, the like main producer and founder of Ufotable. So Ufotable starts in 2000. They work on some very small projects. They're doing like animated intros to like skit shows on Japanese television, that kind of stuff. And then in 2002, they start getting like proper work, working on spin-offs. So they're starting to release different series like Vice Cruise Gluhen. In 2003, they released a show called Dokoida. In 2004, they released a show called Ninja Nonsense. But in 2005, None of those shows like do very big for them. Like I haven't seen them. They don't have like the biggest reputation in the world. In 2005, though, they work alongside two other studios, a studio called Feel and Studio Flag, to release a show called Futakoi Alternative, which is a spin-off of another show called Futakoi. And this show gets a lot of attention. It's really, really, I have not watched it before I understand. It's like fairly unconventional. It's very odd, and it kind of changed a little bit of like people's expectations of the quote from an Aniplex producer that is the producer that ultimately works on Kyoukai was he watched it and was like, oh, I didn't realize like anime could do something like this too. And it's a little bit of the thing that Ufotable effect of like they have a very distinctive style because it's a small, close group knit of artists working together across genres and styles with 2D, 3D, alternative forms of animation as well, like claymation, all working together in a close-knit group to create like a very unique aesthetic and style rather than the big kind of faceless brands of something like Sunrise.
I just got to say, I'm looking at the Wikipedia page for Futakoi Alternative, and it has a hilarious paragraph that has a big, like, Wikipedia saying, like, this needs citation above it, that is someone clearly just writing their own thoughts, because it says, classifying Futakoi Alternative as a specific genre is extremely difficult, although at its core, it is most similar to a romantic comedy. The first handful of episodes are lighthearted, but the series becomes more serious as it approaches its conclusion. The criticisms about the show is normally the same as its accolades, namely that it never settles completely into any one genre or style and switches between them from episode to episode, being almost equal parts romance, action, sci-fi fantasy, and comedy. However, it is a love story at its core.
There you go. That says more than anyone else could, right? And I think that's like the sense I got looking at like the Japanese Wikipedia stuff, which is where, you know, a lot of this information I'm telling you is like stuff that is hard to find on the English internet. And so yes, like that is all the people, like the quotes I saw about it of like, oh man, we watched this thing that Ufotable worked on called Futakoi Alternative. We're like, this thing's fucking crazy. And I have never seen anything like it, but it's something that really gets Ufotable a lot of attention. And in particular, it gets attention from a producer named Iwakami who worked at Aniplex, who also had a copy of Kado no Kyoukai that was given to him by Kinoko Nasu's editor on the book for the Kodansha release, which obviously made like some changes and stuff because it was like the first original proper release of the novels. And so Iwakami, this producer at Aniplex, had this novel. He really liked Kado no Kyoukai. He was like, this is awesome. This is something that like a project that we could get behind and really want to do something with. And then that's right around the time that Futakoi Alternative was coming out. And he watched that. It was like, this is fucking crazy. And it's kind of, I think the thing with Ufotable and Type Moon that immediately makes it, I think, an obvious pairing is that they both come out of, like, I think, a very similar mindset and style. It's both very kind of underground and alternative. And, you know, Ufotable takes that approach to its animation style. It's got this very kind of scrappy quality to it, particularly in these kind of earlier days, that makes it have a really unique, innovative approach that looks unlike other anime. And you can look at any Ufotable production in about 15 seconds, you can tell, oh, Ufotable worked on this. You know, like when I played Tales of Arise last year, they did the opening animation for that game, and I didn't need to see the credit to tell me that. Like, I watched like 10 seconds of the opener. I'm like, oh, fuck, Ufotable did this, huh? And I looked it up. It's like, yeah, Ufotable did this. And there are very few animation studios that you can say that about. There's like Kyoto Animation. There's obviously like movie companies like Studio Ghibli that you can definitely do that with in general. But the vast majority of animation studios, you know, you can't tell whether or not like A1 Pictures put this out or Studio Dean put this out. It's like, you know, directors will have a style, animators will have a style, but studios usually don't. Ufotable definitely does. And then Type Moon as this like fan thing that came up in like, again, this kind of rags to riches story in Nasu's writing, which honestly is a lot more like comes out of this like mystery and sci-fi Japanese novel thing and a little bit less out of like anime and video games and stuff like that. Has a very different, unique perspective and style and tone to it. So it's, I think, an immediate, I can see why the producer for Aniplex would immediately look at these two things and say, we should put these people together because this is like success waiting to happen. The Tsukihime project did not work out for that studio, but this is like a thing that like you can really feel confident that something interesting is going to come out of this. So they go to Kondo Hikaru, the producer at Ufotable, was like, hey, do you want to work on this Kata no Kyoukai thing? And like most of the big guys at Ufotable were all like, we've played like Tsukihime like 3 times. Like we've already read this book. Like they were already big fans of Type Moon because they come out of that same scene, generally speaking. So they jump at that opportunity immediately. It took a little bit more convincing on the Type Moon side because of the experience with the Tsukihime anime to kind of turn around and say like, okay, yeah, we're comfortable with you adapting our stuff. But as soon as they started meeting with the Ufotable people, I think they realized, hey, this is something this is not going to be like last time. They're going to respect like the original work. Like we'll have more input. This is something that could be really special. And then they start working on deciding, okay, let's make it into movies. They decide to do these like kind of movie releases over a pretty short timeline from 2007 to 2009. Eventually you get the 8th movie, which is like a slightly different thing, which we'll talk about when we get there, because that's kind of made afterwards, because another chapter of the books is basically written that takes place in the middle of the story. And the rest is history. Kata no Kyoukai is, again, for like its niche, is very, very successful. The novel has sold something like 700,000 copies. It has never been officially translated. It almost got officially translated into English, and then the company, I think it was like one of the labels for Del Rey went out of they went broke, and so there's like there's some like half-finished official English translation of Kata no Kyoukai that is out on like a server somewhere. There are of course fan translations out there. If people want to read it in English, you have means of doing so, but there's no official release. But that means that like selling hundreds of thousands of copies, like 700,000+ copies, that's like a 2013 number of these books. Like that's a really, really big success for this market. Yeah, and then, the partnership with Kata no Kyoukai or with Ufotable on Kata no Kyoukai is so successful that Ufotable and Type Moon's partnership has gone on, ever since then. The Heaven's Feel movies just finished a couple of years ago. They've done, like, the opening animations on a bunch of the game releases, like the PS2 release of Fate Stay Night. And so the Type Moon Ufotable partnership has proved extremely, extremely fruitful, so much so that on Wikipedia, there's just a thing called there's a whole section of the Type Moon Wikipedia page that is just about the Ufotable, which I found very useful because it compiled all the information across the 2 Wikipedia pages onto one section on one Wikipedia page.
And it's continuing. They're doing a movie of Witch on the Holy Night, which is set to come out maybe next year. That could slip, but yeah, that's coming. I just think it's so cool because you're describing these 2 companies that started basically as just friends wanting to make stuff. And in these small markets. And as you say, Type Moon has gone on to, have the Fate Grand Order, which is one of the biggest video games in the history of the medium. And then you have Ufotable, who made the highest grossing film in the history of Japan, with the Mugen Train film from Kimetsu. It's insane. Literally, both of these are at the absolute top of their respective games. But they've also seemingly stayed themselves in a lot of ways. Like, this isn't a sellout story where they got sold and everyone left, and a lot of the names that you've referenced are still at work in all of these. A lot of the stylistic things we're going to talk about hold true into Kimetsu no Yaiba, and so on and so on. And that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, it was one of the most fun pieces of research for me to do for these podcasts we've done. Going back to Weekly Suit Gundam, just because it was like. It does feel like it's the rare feel-good story, at least so far in media. Because most of this, if you do research on something like, Neon Genesis Evangelion, or on a bunch of the Gundam stuff like Victory Gundam, you end up feeling really bad because you see, oh, this producer fucked with this, or it's like, oh, this company went bankrupt, or this person, came to hate the thing they worked on, or whatever. But this is just, it does feel like it's this rare instance of, really, really talented, creative people being able to find success making the art that they want to make in their own markets, and then being able to come together and collaborate over the course of 15 years basically at this point, and still putting out work together. Obviously there is stuff. Type Moon is so big now, they have so many projects that there are non-Ufotable Type Moon adaptations. And some of those, like the Fate Grand Order anime, is quite good. But there's always something when you see, oh, this spin-off or whatever was animated by this other company, you're like, ah, damn it. because you know that like you have some real magic waiting for you if you get Ufotable adapting like a proper Type Moon project.
One other thing I wanted to say that I found out while you were doing your whole spiel is that Witch on the Holy Night remake that's coming out of the visual novel. It's not coming out next year, Sean. It's coming out next month. It's December 7th. I'm saying this, listeners are hearing this later. So like if you're listening to this podcast, it's been out for a while on Switch and PS4. There's already a demo. I'm very excited for that. That sounds great because it's been frustrating. This is like one of the only Type Moon novels that's come out in English. So I've always wished we could get an official translation of Fate's Day Night or something, you know?
Yeah. It's I have no idea why. Because even when they have done re-releases of Fate's Day Night in Japan, for whatever reason, it has never, there's like a mobile version of it in Japan. They later put the PS2 version on PC, all of which happened well after this stuff started becoming popular over here because of the anime stuff. But for whatever reason, those have never gotten official translation. It's usually just like the video games, like a Fate Grand Order, that get the official translations for Type Moon. And it's very weird to me because there's such a big fan base and there's such a big market for it. But, I'll go into more depth with this when we get to Fate's Day Night. But if people are just curious, like how I got into it, by reading the fan translation of Fate's Day Night in like my junior or senior year of high school, sometime around there. Like I would have been like 17-ish, I think. Mostly because I was curious about visual novels. I had read a couple of visual novels because they started getting big around that time. This is like when Danganronpa and stuff like that was starting to come out. And I just Googled, hey, what's like, if you want to just like read the best visual novel, because it's a genre I know very little about. Like, what's the best one? And Fate's Day Night was just the thing that always came up. It's like, hey, you got to read this fan translation. And it was like, oh, but it's about historical and like mythological figures fighting in like magic battles in contemporary Japan. I'm like, that sounds like 100% my shit. And read it, and my mind was blown by it. And that's kind of how I got into this world. And the fan translations for Fate's Day Night are very good if people want to go read those. But it is very heartening that we are finally getting an official translation of something. It would have been great if they just put out a remake of the first half of Tsukihime, which from what I understand is like kind of like a Final Fantasy VII remake style remake. It's more than just a remake, but they just put that out last year and it didn't get an English release. It was like, why not put it out here too?
It's bizarre because it's obviously these are long. It's a lot to translate, but it's translating text. Like it's cheap. If fans are doing it, you can do it and make money on it, Yeah,
and like if any visual novels are worth the effort to translate into English in a financial sense, it would be these ones. You're guaranteed to make your money back because that audience is there in Hungary.
Yes, but by the time this airs, I will probably have read The Witch on the Holy Night because I'm very excited, and it's coming to Switch. That's perfect. That's the right place for visual novels to be. So there you go.
Anyway, so it's a little bit off topic, but that's our big history lesson. That's where Type Moon comes from. Obviously, when we get to some of like Fate Zero and Fate's Day Night, we'll talk a little bit more in detail about the specific production of those things, particularly for Fate's Day Night, since I've got like a lot of my own personal experience with that one as a visual novel versus being an anime. But this is where, in many ways, in terms of like their success for Ufotable, where Ufotable comes from, because no Kyoukai is by far their biggest project at the time that they made it. Like it was the thing that got them by far the most attention because they're sort of like coming up on that like same rising swell as Type Moon and launches them into like other really big projects. But this is also, where Type Moon comes from. And I think all this stuff is very interesting to me.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to go through all of it, but for now, what we've got in front of us is two confusing but interesting and wonderful episodes / movies of Kara no Kyoukai / The Garden of Sinners. Should we break these down, Sean?
Yes. So, as we talked about already, these are told out of chronological order. This is like the way it was originally designed. The first movie and the first chapter of the book are pretty different in terms of how they're told out of chronological order. I guess that'll make more sense when I explain it more. But like those are more different. The second movie and the second chapter are very similar. The third movie and the third chapter are very similar. I haven't gotten further in the book yet. So I assume that it probably continues to be pretty similar. Past that point, I think probably the first chapter is where the most changes are made in adaptation for some, I think, clear reasons, just in terms of practical stuff. But yes, these are told out of chronological order. The first movie takes place. It's like the third or fourth thing, I think, technically in the timeline on the Wikipedia. Would they say the fifth? But that's because they added a thing that takes place before that later. It's right. So there's like a whole jumbled timeline of the order of these things. In general, the first movie actually takes place sometime in the midpoint of the story. And the second movie is the earliest point in the story. So it's this kind of prologue almost that gives you a sense of where these characters are going to go. And then you visit them of how did they meet? How, like, what is this kind of world they inhabit? What is this, like, taste you get? But it leaves that stuff hanging to be resolved eventually by the end of the story in part 7.
Yes. And immediately, the thing that is striking about the first episode, or the first movie, which is called, what's it called?
Overlooking View. Yeah.
Yeah. These all have very striking titles, and they have different versions, because they have, some are direct translations and some are a little different. But yes, they all have... This is so funny. I was just bringing up the Wikipedia page to check something, and I accidentally went to the Wikipedia page for The Garden of Words, which is a short film by Makoto Shinkai that could not possibly be more different than The Garden of Sinners. The Garden of Words is about a boy who is in love with his teacher. The Garden of Sinners is about a person killing people and ghosts and stuff. I don't know. I can't say what it's about yet, but it is very striking. And I do think, like, I make the Persona 3 connection. I mean, there's, like, superficial stuff that I can point to, like, hey, they're led by a red-haired woman, and there's a blue-haired boy, and the streets are eerily empty, and there's a lot of green in the color scheme, there's a lot of stuff about the moon and butterflies, blah, 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 right? They use the word Thanatos in it, you know. It's all about death. But it really is just that vibe of the first episode and that atmosphere of it being kind of, like, just overwhelmingly dark and mysterious and, like, almost suffocating, but in a very, like, I think interesting and engaging way. You know, it has the whole just the streets are empty and the characters kind of exist in this big world on their own, and death is sort of everywhere, but it's almost not like death to be feared. It's like death as something interesting and intoxicating. It's hard to explain, but that was where my mind went, because before now I would have said Persona 3, particularly like the beginning of that game, is one of the most singular things I've ever seen. It's just very, very unique. And then I saw this and I'm like, this is one of the first things I've seen that kind of reminds me of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. I think it's one of the, like, intentional elements of telling the story out of chronological order is that it disorients the viewer coming into this movie, because this movie does, like, nothing really to onboard you or intro you to these characters. Like, you could very easily put this movie anywhere else, really, in the sequence, in the sense of, like, there's nothing about it that feels specifically like this is the first part of the story. This is where you're learning about these characters of this world. And it has less of that than the book. The book does a lot more of that, of where it'll throw in sentences here or there, because you're looking at the book is told in first person POV from in this first chapter, 3 characters' perspective: Shiki's, Kokoto's, and then Fujo, the woman who's like kind of the ghostly apparition that's killing people. And then that's sort of the same across all the chapters. Is you have your 2 main POV characters, Kokoto and Shiki, and then you have a third character that's the character this chapter is about, usually the antagonist or someone like that. And so you're in those characters' heads, so you get to throw in little bits of exposition that orient you more around, okay, they met in high school. It's like, okay, here's, like, you get, like, a little bit more of that context. The movie gives you almost none of that. But the advantage that has is that it kind of means you can kind of ignore that. And I think it allows you to just really sit in the mood of the story, because very, very little happens in the movie. You know, it's not a very long movie. It's like 50 minutes, and it's got almost no plot. You know, I mean, a lot of, like, the plot of the movie is stuff that you're not even shown. Like, you never see Kokoto, like, enter his comatose state or any of that. All that is stuff that you just get kind of implied and you kind of go along with at a certain point. And so you just are given, I think, free reign to sort of let the plot take back seat, just roll with it. just give yourself up to the movie. And so much of the movie's runtime, instead of it being exposition and setting up the plot in really clear ways, it's more, here's like a long scene of Shiki walking the streets alone at night, and here's like this little dog that walks past her, and she's going to the building, and you're just with her in that moment, almost like a little bit reminiscent of the big scene in the middle of Ghost in the Shell. Or you have a scene that's original to this movie that I love, which is Shiki eating the strawberry ice cream in her apartment alone, which is like such a good, powerful scene that they just hold on. You're just with her in that moment for so long, just getting to feel her emotions, be in that apartment. Like her shitty little tiny apartment in Japan is an area we will revisit obviously throughout these movies, and it's one of my favorite sets, quote unquote. Obviously it's not a real set, but like a location or sort of set in anime, because it captures a mood of what it is to live in this like very stark place, and her kind of relationship to that space is so evocative. And that's the thing about the first movie in particular I love, is that you're just there sitting with this character and basking in all of it, and the plot is stuff that's happening, and you get a couple of cool action scenes, and you're just sort of rolling with it, but you're really there to listen to the music and see the visuals and kind of empathize with these characters and kind of explore this weird space that they exist in.
Absolutely. I want to come back to the ice cream eating scene because it's one of my notes. I just have the ice cream eating scene. Wow. Because it is incredible. Absolutely. But I think you're so right, and I think Ghost in the Shell is actually, and all of the works by that director, whose name is escaping me at the moment, but the guy who did Ghost in the Shell, like Pat Labor has scenes like that too, of just, we're going to like kind of exist in the world for a minute, and I think that's a very good comparison, although they're even quieter and eerier here, because he usually has some like eerie music that will play and stuff, and there's phenomenal music in these movies, but that first one, there's a lot of scenes that are just silent. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. What's fascinating to me of what you just said is that Shiki is a POV narrator in the book. That surprises me watching the anime, because in these first two episodes, she is a mystery to the point where I'm not sure I'm using the right pronoun for her, like she, her, because I don't know if I'm on point here or what. Maybe this comes up, maybe it doesn't. But my read on that first episode and parts of the second is that gender is going to be a theme in this show.
Yes.
Because, like, I literally could not tell what gender this person was supposed to be for most of this first episode, if they were supposed to be gendered at all. I mean, the actor is a woman, and I know that because I've heard her in other stuff, but you have women voice boys and vice versa and all sorts of stuff in anime, right? And so that doesn't necessarily signify anything. And then there is a very pointed, the final line of the first movie is Kokuto looking at her and saying, "You're a girl after all." And she kind of turns over and is like mad to have heard that. And then that's how the episode ends. And then in the second one is a woman, but then you're getting into like gender roles in terms of like her inheritance and this kind of stuff is brought up. So clearly gender is a big deal, and the character is drawn so intentionally androgynous that I feel like I want to more go with like they is where my mind is going, but I'm not sure because I haven't seen more of the series. And like Shiki in this first episode has such a lack of a sense of self, or at least that is presented to us. Maybe there's something in there that we're not seeing or accessing, that I don't know if like gender is even a thought in their head. You know what I mean? Like it's so kind of deadened inside, and I love all of that. And I think what does position this as a first episode is that the first scene of this entire big crazy project is just Kokuto coming into the apartment with one of those Haagen-Dazs cups. And if you've been to Japan, that apartment is very familiar. That's basically a mansion, which has a different meaning in America than it does in Japan. Mansion is used in Japan to be like the little apartments that single people live in. And my brother lived in one of those for over a year, and I stayed with him for a couple weeks when I was in Japan. And Shiki's is bigger than I think that room would actually be, but in part that's because they're distorting it visually and all this stuff, right? And it's completely empty. She hasn't put anything in there other than a bed on the ground, right?
Yeah.
And so it's completely empty. But like that is so familiar. And then you bring in the Haagen-Dazs, and of course those little personal ice cream cups. This is something I miss from the month I spent in Japan, is that it's so much easier to eat as a single person in Japan because they have single food portions of everything that you can just go buy, and it's great. And they have that, and that little ice cream cup with the little like wooden scoop, and he brings that in, and he's trying to connect with her, and she is kind of impossible to access, and he is giving her the strawberry, they're going interchangeably between the English word strawberry and the Japanese word ichigo, which you might know if you've read Bleach. And they're going interchangeably between those, and he's trying to say like, oh, you'll like this, and she's like, I don't like ice cream, and why strawberry? And he said, well, it might be your personality, and he points out the red leather jacket that she has that will become an increasingly big thing over these first 2 hours, and I assume more of it because I've seen the key art and she's always in it, and it's iconic because red leather jacket over a kimono is quite a look. But yeah, and I think just that little like personal touch. Again, this is me extrapolating. I have no idea what happens in the rest of these. For all I know, Kokuto gets shot and he's not even a character. I don't know, right? But like, it seems to me like that table setting of that first scene is Kokuto trying to get into this person's head and her not wanting anyone in there. And at least for these first two, that's what they're all about. And so like, if there's a reason why this is the beginning, that is a like thesis statement scene, I feel like.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in the book, and again, this first movie, the adaptation is so different than like the second movie adapting the second chapter, which is very, very close. But I think they're like making a lot of little changes to sort of fit what they need to do because the first chapter is really stylistically crazy. So the first chapter of the book is told out of chronological order. So in the book, the purpose of that first chapter is to teach you how to read the story. And so, like, you know, the end of this movie where Kokuto wakes up and you have the scene where Toko tells him, hey, you know, get me a cup of coffee. It'll serve as good rehabilitation for you. That's like the third scene in the book. And you read it from Kokuto's perspective. You see he narrates the dream of the dragonfly and the butterfly. He wakes up on the couch, he hears that, and he thinks to himself, rehabilitation, like, what the fuck does that mean, basically? And he kind of lets it go by. You don't realize in the book until about 2/3 of the way through the story that Kokuto has spent the entirety of August in a comatose state, because the book is jumping in the timeline, and depending on whose POV you're in, you're looking at a different point in the order of events, and there are, like, little tiny hints throughout that this information is being presented to you in an out-of-order fashion, and it's not until you get pretty far in where you kind of put it together. Oh, shit. Kokuto, this is what has happened. Kokuto's, like, consciousness or something has been taken by this, like, spirit or whatever that is haunting this building, and you go back and you reread the first 2/3 of the chapter again, now picking up all those hints, and every single scene reads kind of completely differently. Like the scene where Kokuto is sitting there comatose on the couch, and Toko says, like, man, when will he come home? Like, our boy. In the anime, that is very ominous because you can see Kokuto is sitting there non-moving and not reacting to anything. In the book, you have no idea that he's just there. You think, like, oh, did he go out to the convenience store to get, like, a hot dog or whatever, like, get lunch? And they're like, when is he going to come back? And it's not until you get the full context that you read that scene and you realize there's a whole other layer to the conversation. So that's what the chapter is about in the book. And it's interesting because it serves a very different purpose to me than the movie, where for the book, it's about teaching you this story is presenting you puzzle pieces out of order. And it is a mystery story, not because, like, there's a Sherlock Holmes figure in the story solving things. It's like you are meant to be putting the pieces together of the story as it's presented to you out of order. And that first chapter, I think, is meant to teach you that is what this story is. Whereas for the movie, I think they don't do that because it would be very hard, I think, to elegantly present the same thing. The book books being able to have really flexible POVs that can move you really rapidly and it feeling totally natural is a thing that allows Nasu to pull this trick in a thing that is like a 30 to 40 page short story. Whereas I think it would be very, very hard to do the same thing in a movie without like just completely alienating your audience. So instead, they center the movie very much on Shiki. It's about staying with her for the whole duration of that plot and existing with her in that moment and kind of trying to figure out who she is and what is going on here, but in less of that kind of mystery puzzle piece kind of way. And it's cool because I think both of them are like really good at what they do. They are fundamentally the same plot. Almost every single scene in the movie, with the exception of the strawberry scene, has a direct equivalent from the book. It's just used in a different way. And it's a really cool piece of adaptation in that sense, because they're both unconventional openings, and they're using this unconventional opening to serve one purpose in the novel and to serve a different purpose in the movie, but they're both equally successful, I think.
Oh, yeah, and that sounds fascinating to me, because I would not have guessed. This feels like so intentional in how they've adapted it, that if you had told me this is a very direct adaptation, I would believe you. But it also makes sense, because a lot of what this first episode is doing is much more specifically cinematic. Like, you're correct that Shiki is basically our POV in this first episode, and that she's the center of every scene. I struggle to call her a POV, though, because we're not inside her head.
Yes.
Like, it's all exteriors, really. Like, the ice cream eating scene is kind of the perfect example of that is not her narrating, I am sad, and so I am lonely, and I miss my friend Kokuto, and so I am sitting here eating this ice cream that he gave me, right? You can infer that if you want. That might be a slightly simplistic reading on the scene, but like that's one way you could read it. But it is completely, we are looking at her and inferring things, and that is like a uniquely cinematic device that you can use. You know, I mean, you can do that in a book, but at the point where you're bringing words into it and directly describing it, you're giving it some kind of spin, right?
Yeah.
And so it's different. An episode, or the second film, which is then very directly from Kokuto's point of view to the point where he narrates it. And
Yes.
it's a little less cinematic in that sense, because it just, that I will say that second movie feels more literary. It feels like it's a little, I mean, one, it's more linear. It's not like clear. It is still confusing in a whole lot of ways, but you're confused in the ways Kokuto is confused, basically, which is like that alignment. And in Garden of Sinners, you know, you are watching things happen that I would assume that if I watched all of these movies and then came back around and watched this one, I would be seeing a completely different movie in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's fascinating because I haven't ever rewatched this first movie. So this is the first time I've rewatched it. And it is like, I think it is a very different experience. When you know who the characters are, you know who Shiki is, you know what her entire deal is, and like Kokuto and their relationship and everything, you know, the whole story. Yes, like the experience, I think, of watching it is very different. And you get to watch it almost as a more conventional movie in some ways, because you have access to that interiority that you have gained because you have, I'm going back to that puzzle metaphor, you know, once you have put together the full puzzle, you can never unsee that full puzzle picture. So it's like you kind of always have that relationship with the character. I think it would be interesting for you to, once you've done the full thing, to go back and circle back around to the first movie and see like how maybe scenes maybe read differently to you.
It's so dense that, I mean, I came away from it wanting to rewatch it, but there was another movie ahead of me to go to the next one, you know? But I was like, I already kind of wanted to pick it apart, and it'll probably be more enjoyable to pick it apart once I have more. But again, on its own, I find it very interesting. But with everything you're talking about, this is slightly off topic, but I am curious, Sean. You have much more experience with visual novels than I do. But the couple that I have read and gone through, and I would include stuff in here like 13 Sentinels, Aegis Rim, which has a video game attached to it, but is essentially a visual novel. The whole idea of, I always associate visual novels as with like chronological out of time storytelling. Is that like the Type Moon touch? Is that kind of the innovation that I'm forgetting the author, Kinoko Nasu kind of brings to it?
No, I mean, so that you are right to say that visual novels have a like weird time thing. That is not a Nasu invention, though. That is like, because visual novels not always, but lots and lots of visual novels do the thing because they have the multiple different routes. They really like to then thematize and bring into the story a meta narrative of this is in some way, in maybe a literal way, in a metaphysical way, the experience that the character is having is re-experiencing these events in a different way and stuff like that. That is a common thing. That's actually not what happens in Fate Stay Night. I'll say like the stylistic thing, and we'll talk about that in this in more depth when we get to Fate Stay Night, but just like to give you a little bit of an answer to that question. The big thing that Fate Stay Night does that I think is very different from any other visual novel I've done, which is it only has 3 routes, and those routes are played in a specific order. Every time, if you play that game from the beginning, from like a fresh save, you will always play that game, the Fate route, the Unlimited Blade Works route, the Heaven's Feel route, because those routes, even though it is, broadly speaking, the same story, that you're always going back to the beginning, and then you're going through this like adventure to the characters to the broad ending point. I mean, all of it obviously branches off to be very, 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 very different. But those stories are meant to be told in that specific order because you, the reader, take information that you are given in previous stories, and you, the reader, build on that, even if the characters don't have access to that information. And so there's an escalation of the themes and ideas, and all 3 of those routes are in conversation with each other, and they build on each other. And that's, to me, the genius of Fate Stay Night as a visual novel and part of Nasu's storytelling. So it's less of him playing with time, but he does play with how do these themes and ideas complicate themselves and evolve. And there's like a very introspective nature to his writing that I think you also see very much in Kyoukai, and we'll see as this continues to go on, of this like self-questioning and this pushing deeper and deeper into more fundamental kind of almost like philosophical questions. And that's, I think, what you get with Kyoukai, and I think that's part of the effect you get when you cycle back around and if you rewatch it. And thinking about rewatching, like that is, I think that urge to want to rewatch the first movie is like there very intentionally, because again, that chapter is basically written to be read twice. It is written for you to hit a certain point and then reread from that to that point again with this information you now have to unlock the deeper meaning. And that to me is the Nasu style, that you have, now that you know this thing, let's revisit these concepts and see what happens when you push it even deeper.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I know Garden of Sinners is not a visual novel, but obviously it's written by one of the most famous visual novelists. So
yes.
Yeah, and obviously it's all related. So yeah, that's interesting. But yes, getting back on point to the Garden of Sinners, I also just, to shift focus for a second and talk about the Ufotable side of this, it's an incredible production. It is 2007. It is clearly, to my eyes at least, I didn't look at like the production notes. It's obviously sub HD, I think, like I would imagine. Like you're starting to get some HD productions in 2007, like Gundam 00 is a full-on high-definition production. You also have stuff like Death Note that year that is a completely standard definition production. Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, which we just finished talking about in the last season of Japanimation Station, I think that's technically like a 540p, so it looks a little awkward at 1080p because there's extra artifacting. This one is clearly, I think, probably in that like 540 range, because you've got some like on the line work on characters, a little fuzziness from the up conversion and stuff like that. But, you know, the basics of obviously the storyboarding and the direction and the layout of every scene is extremely striking. But you also do have these CGI moments. And it is in sort of, you know, I would say the earlier era of anime's involvement with CGI is this very clear bifurcation where most shots just don't have it. And then the shots that do have it tell you they have it very clearly, right? And this is definitely doing that. There's like a big spinning aerial shot of Shiki near the end of the big action sequence in the middle of the film that is like the CGI centerpiece of the episode. In episode 2, you have this really striking shot right at the beginning where Shiki goes walking out at night from her home, and there's walking in her POV seeing the bamboo go by. That's a very clear CGI shot. And I would say, you know, especially in like a modern Ufotable production like Kimetsu no Yaiba, they're much more fluid about the interchange between, you know, your sort of hand-drawn planar stuff and your 3D CGI stuff interact very clearly. And yet, I was still found myself going, but the use of it here is like very advanced for 2007.
Yes.
If I think of other anime stuff from the time. And it's I don't know if it's even that it's advanced on like a technical level, because I doubt Ufotable had the biggest budget in the world. It's just like conceptually, it feels like there's a fluidity in how it's being used in those moments. And there's a lot of intentionality with, I used the big aerial shot, but honestly, the most striking moments of CG in these first 2 episodes are to convey point of view from someone's eyes, of like going over the side of the building to like that idea of the overlooking view, of the suicidal view. They do that, of the walking shot I talked about earlier. And POV shots are something that are actually very hard to do in anime if you're not using a computer, because when you're drawing and it's a planar 2D image, you typically are taking kind of a side view of the world, not a from the person's eyes view. And so that's something they're using here. And those are just those striking moments where I do go, okay, this is the studio that one day is going to do episode 19 of Kimetsu no Yaiba,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, 100%. Like it's I just say that their techniques are not as advanced for obvious reasons, because they haven't, this is still really new stuff. But it's striking how much of that Ufotable style is there so early. Again, this is a company that was, this movie came out 7 years after this company was formed, right? So it's like, this is a young animation studio. I mean, it's got a lot of experienced people there, but the studio is very young. And that like 360 shot on the rooftop to me is like a big Ufotable moment, because it's like, it's such a Ufotable shot. And it's like, as you say, it's not a thing that like technically other studios couldn't do, but I think it's the like idea of blending the 3D and the 2D elements so well, and hitting these like big crescendos or powerful moments where it's like asking for the like cinematic language to kind of open up and change. And that like spinning shot as you come in on Shiki and the music is swelling with the main theme of the series, like it's this very powerful, rousing moment. And it is a style thing that like marks it to me very much as a Ufotable production, even so early in their life as a studio. It's a shot that like you look at it and you're like, yeah, no, this is a Ufotable thing. It's pretty stark. I think how much you can see it.
And I think you're right in also identifying they're bringing the characters into it. It's a part of the story.
Yeah.
It's the aesthetic is not completely broken. It's sort of like breached or evolved. Sort of like I always think of with, Kimetsu no Yaiba, the thing that makes it so revelatory isn't that something comes in and happens to Tanjiro in episode 19. He breaks a boundary and goes flying into 3 dimensions, but with his normal animated animatic proportions of his body, right? And that's the Ufotable thing. That's the thing you don't often see. Whereas it's a little more traditional to have, like, let's say in Gundam The Origin, to use something we've talked about, that you'll just have the mobile suits will be CG because of how they move makes it, work better in that form, but everything else is still sort of your normal animation, right? And that's a pretty typical use. And that's 2015. And I would say from a, like, thinking about it in terms of animation, this is more advanced than a lot of that. There's the moment in episode 5 of Gundam The Origin where Char goes flying down into the entire battlefield. That's kind of an Ufotable kind of shot, right? And you get hints of it here, and that's so cool.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It was very pleasing for me to, it's been so long since I watched these. And I mean, the last time I watched these would have been like a couple of years before Kimetsu no Yaiba came out. And so it is like very satisfying to go back to it and be like, yes, it's still here. Like you can see the breadcrumb trails that lead us to like Mugen Train and that kind of stuff. 100%. One thing I want to hit on just like while I'm thinking about it also, because you kind of hinted at some of this stuff earlier, and I don't want to say too much, obviously, to give stuff away, but to hit on like, you were kind of looking at, there's some of the themes that maybe this is exploring with Shiki as a character, and the gender thing. Like this absolutely is thinking a lot about gender, not to like get into what it is saying. And I'll say that like for me, I'm going to just like default to using she and her for Shiki because it's what I'm used to. And I think when we get deeper in, we can talk about like what would be the most appropriate use of gender, because I think that's a complicated question that changes maybe like at what point you are in the story. It kind of evolves in certain ways. But it is a thing with Shiki as a character that you are meant to be put at a strong remove from her. And even when you're reading the book, while she's technically a POV character, like her POV still feels very foreign and very alien, even when you're in her head, because most of her POV is either her looking at Kokuto as Kokuto's in her room talking to her. So like that scene, the strawberry ice cream scene, is told from her POV, but it's mostly her kind of describing what Kokuto is doing and her thinking about him. And giving you a little bit of context for what their history is. And then a lot of the other scenes with Shiki is either her fighting or her walking around the city at night. And you're at like a bit of a remove where you're not fully in her head, you're not fully seeing through her eyes. And then when you get to the second chapter, that remove is used very strategically, obviously, with like the serial killer plot line to try to disorient you to figure out what is she killing people or not. But like while she is a POV character, it is a complex POV, even in the novel, even though you're first person. And I think what they do with the movie I think they replicate that kind of cold remove you have, and you're wanting to access her interiority, and you're very struggling to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. It's it's fascinating because I haven't quite seen a character exactly like this, where there's this much mystery around the person this central to the thing. It is, just to talk about the performance here, it is amazing to have Maya Sakamoto here 1 year after Persona 3, where she plays Aigis, and of course an amazing and memorable performance of one of the best characters in the history of fiction. Aigis a much warmer character than, Aigis also mysterious, but mysterious in a completely different way. And I think I wasn't quite realizing I recognized the voice until deeper into the episode, where she does get a little more emotive because there's like some heightened things going on. But it's interesting, and because they're both robotic in completely different ways, where Aigis is the sort of, prototypical robot who wants to be human, right? And it almost feels like Shiki is the human who aspires to be or acts like a robot, is this interesting sort of thing that we are presented with. That might be completely off base based on what happens in the future of the series, just saying what I have access to right now. But it's an extremely striking performance, and I generally think the voice acting in these are obviously very, very strong. But that one definitely, it's such a difficult line to walk, because I feel like any performance is you're gonna put some spin on the ball once you have a human being performing the lines. And I feel like, I don't know if there's that many other actors other than Maya Sakamoto who could kind of thread the needle that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great performance. To me, it's like one of her iconic performances. She is also, like, particularly if you're going to, like, Fate Grand Order, which Shiki appears in that game through, like, a crossover event. She voices, like, I don't know, maybe like 10 characters or something at this point in FGO, because she also sings all the, like, songs for FGO that, like, are on the commercials and stuff. So she's, like, very involved in a lot of Type Moon stuff. This is not a character we will meet unless we do any of the spin-offs, but she plays Joan of Arc in the Fate world, which is her other, like, really big character, which is a very, very different performance from Shiki. But yeah, like, this is a big, I think, role for Sakamoto Maya, because, as you say, she's coming off of Persona 3. Like, she's very much a rising star at this point. Her music career is also starting at this point. And it's a really challenging role, I think, particularly because there's like a lot of different kind of, like, versions of the character. I mean, we've seen that already. Like, we have this kind of present-day Shiki, and then you have high school Shiki, and you have two personalities for high school Shiki, right?
Two very different personalities. Like,
yes.
Two personalities different enough that they could have gotten away with having two actors if they wanted to, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah. And she definitely does a lot to also, and Suzumu Kenichi, who plays Kokuto, also, like, modulates their voice very effectively to sound younger in movie 2. But yeah, like, I think Sakamoto Maya is just asked to do a lot to play this character who has these different, kind of, like, modes or whatever, this, like, different versions of the character that we meet throughout this story. And she's being asked, to very much play the character androgynously, and it's so effective. One of the things with Shiki that we see in movie 1, and then you get with one of the Shikis in movie 2, is Shiki refers to themselves, to non-gender it here for a second, with the personal pronoun ore, which is a very masculine pronoun. It's a pronoun that, like, if you were a woman living in Japan and you use that to refer to yourself, people would either think you're like joking or that you're kind of crazy, because it's very masculine. You know, you could do boku and it would still be unconventional, another masculine pronoun, but you could kind of get away with it, particularly if you're younger, and people wouldn't think it's that weird. But typically you would use watashi. In the second movie, one of the shikis, the more feminine shiki, refers to herself as watashi. But you also have this ore voice, and her whole, like Shiki's whole speaking style in movie 1 is very, very masculine coded, which is what leads to the line at the end by Kokuto. That's what, in a way that's, I think, kind of very hard to translate, because Shiki doesn't say anything in terms of the literal words that's like coarse or inappropriate. It's just the manner of speech is very masculine, and that's what Kokuto responds to. And that will be a scene that we can revisit when we get deeper in and kind of learn more about Shiki's character. But it's a fascinating line that Sakamoto Maya is being asked to walk with this weird androgynous character that shifts and modulates at these different points in the timeline that we meet them. And particularly, I mean, you get two really extreme versions of it in these first two movies, and it's very, very, very effective. And I think an extremely impressive performance.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do we want to say about the actual sort of like plot of this episode, in that we have this mysterious building where girls are jumping off and committing suicide. There's a lot of big gushes of blood in this. Both of these. Why am I saying this one? Both of these have a lot of blood. I assume future episodes will have a lot of blood.
Yes.
This is a bloody-ass series. And there is this, we eventually find out there's this woman in the hospital who is essentially, I think I have the, sorry, that's my dog is shaking over here. But he's essentially in the hospital, like astrally projecting into this building to haunt it. And that's how Kokuto gets caught up in all of this. And Shiki rescues Kokuto by like breaking this curse. And then the woman who like heads their little gang, I'm not sure what that is, goes and confronts her in the hospital. All of this stuff happens. This is very much an episode about death, and it's an episode about suicide, and has very frank conversations about all of this. There's a lot of the kind of dialogue that's sort of like, you know, philosophizing the themes of death and suicide. And the whole idea of the overlooking view is a very, you know, philosophical idea they push very hard in here. And I could imagine if the writing were like 1% less good, it would be absolutely in-fucking terminable. Instead, I think it's like fascinating and really kind of rich and deep. And I don't know, it's just the kind of thing where if you're not a good writer, that thing will, even if you're a very good writer but want to be pretentious, that could come off insufferable, and it doesn't. And I think that's the thing that made me go, this is a really interesting series.
Yeah, that's like a very Nasu like style of the kind of the philosophizing, particularly through Toko, who is like their boss. It's like I didn't realize how you really know nothing about that character in the first two movies, so it's like, oh, it's like too much about Toko. But right, she is the philosopher, right? And I love Toko's writing because she's like, so she's got this very like logical, literal approach to things that she takes super far, that like pushes her analysis into almost like a metaphysical space, but she defines things through extremely logical parameters. And I think that's the thing that makes it work for me, is one, you have a contrast between Toko, who likes to philosophize and push things to this like these logical extremes. You've got Shiki, who is very closed off to that, is like, I just want to stab shit. I'm just going to go for a walk. She just does not care. She shuts down about that kind of stuff. You don't get as much of Kokuto in the movie as you do in the book, but Kokuto is like somewhere in the middle, where he's very like open to everything. And he's kind of like a big, you know, sponge or whatever. He kind of like accepts whatever people tell him. You know, you have in this movie, you do have that conversation where Shiki asks him about suicide, and his answer is very interesting because he gives this very like weird broad answer where it's not a yes or a no. It's like, well, you know, if I could, you know, if me dying could save everybody's life, then yes, I would do it. But I would do it not because I was doing something noble, but because I would be too afraid to live my life, you know, being despised by the rest of the world because of like the sins that would commit by being surviving. And so he has this very open sort of exploratory space that he lives in, and that like those contrasts, like the person who shuts everything down, the person who like philosophizes like into this extreme metaphysical space of talking about the overlooking view and the like juxtaposition between the boxes we live in and the horizon that we can see, and that some people have a fracture that they can't like equate or resolve those two experiences, and that's what kind of creates what Fujo is, the ghost or the astral projecting woman in this. And then you have Tokoto in the middle, who's sort of like open and exploring all of these things in that spectrum. It's just a very effective 3-character setup who are like 3 sort of main recurring characters. And the first chapter of the book, one thing that's different than the movie is that it's very set up in the book as a series of conversations between different combinations of those 3 characters, and it's a lot less actiony. And the movie, I think, is smart to like make it more actiony and make it more you're in the moment and kind of getting that moody stuff. And then you get these like sparks of really interesting dialogues between the characters rather than it being just dialogue, which works for a book but wouldn't work as well for a movie.
Yeah, the scene you mentioned with Kokuto talking about his thoughts on suicide is exactly what I was talking about earlier, where I feel like there's this level of him talking about the, you know, the like, well, if I had a deadly virus and then, you know, this would be, I would kill myself and that would be good. That's the level where like I feel like a lot of works would try to go with the philosophizing and it would feel kind of inane and stupid. And then he says, but that's inane and stupid. And then he goes to this deeper level that's like very knowingly ugly of the, but I would be doing it because it would be so hard to live in the world where I had fucked over Tokyo by not killing myself, basically, right? And I feel like that's the level of, like, I like that each of these conversations, you can feel the, like, level of, like, you know, I think of it like as, like, college quad philosophizing, right? And then it pushes past that and goes to somewhere really interesting. And you get that a lot, obviously, with Toko, talking about suicide and the idea of floating versus flying. And obviously, this is all through the imagery, I think, helps a great deal in illustrating a lot of this, which I know would not be there in the book, but definitely for the film version that I have seen, you know, the whole idea of an overlooking view is something they do such a good job of in this movie, of, like, this kind of, like, imagery of a suicidal ideation and where does it come from, and like literally about a boundary being crossed. And of course that's there in the title, so like the word kara is going to come up a lot in the dialogue and you're going to hear it and all that kind of stuff. Yeah,
it's a lot of that stuff to me I find very like powerful. There's lots of really, really good lines in this that have stuck with me since I originally watched this. There's the one that particularly struck me when I read it in the book because it's such a strong line, which is it's what Toko says to Fujo when she leaves the hospital room, which is like, you know, basically like whatever you do is like whatever you do from here is your choice. But don't like let your guilty conscience choose what path you take, because you have that has it backwards. You don't pick the path you walk because of the sins you've bared. You bear sins because of the path you've chosen to walk. And that is such a like striking line to me, that like really like kind of hits you really hard. It's like, it's okay for you to like, as long as it's like the path that you have chosen for yourself, it is okay to like to have those sins that you will have to bear in order to walk along that path. But letting yourself be cowed into going or like pressured into going a certain way in your life because you feel guilty, because you've done these bad things, that's like, as a person, that is a mistake. And that's, I think, like a really striking concept to me.
Absolutely. That's one of many scenes in this episode that I did have to double back on. And like, I was like, that's an interesting line. Because it's such a, like, some of these lines have such a sort of dense, like, circularity to them with like repeated words and wordplay almost, that I had to like rewind and go, okay, let's break that down. This took me longer than 50 minutes to watch, I will say.
Yes.
One of the ones that I love that also, because I took pictures of these lines just so I would have it for later, because I might even, this makes me think of some thoughts I'm having writing my dissertation, which is about anime and will involve some Ufotable productions. And there's this line Toko has where she says, visions are not images that we gaze at with our eyes, rather they're images that our brains comprehend. What we see is protected by our own common sense. In other words, people can't survive outside their own little boxes under normal circumstances. That's one of those, like, that's trippy and actually very interesting and thoughtful. And then the way I think the way Ufotable takes some of those ideas and runs with it in how they kind of break visual space in their productions is very interesting. And in this, obviously, too.
Yeah, and that line is a very good example of what I meant by, like, Toko takes things, like, her philosophizing is very strictly logical, right? And that's, like, a very logical way to analyze this process. That's like, no, you don't see things with your eye, you see things with your brain, and all the images that you see are processed through your brain. And so
it's an extremely complicated version of the Sherlock Holmes truism, right? About like, eliminate what can't be true, whatever is left must be true. Like, right? The basic Sherlock Holmes analysis. That's basically what she's saying about like seeing ghosts but not admitting it. You know, I love it. It's like a much, much more, even more like logical, but like almost logical on acid version of Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, no, yeah, it is very much, it's that, like, you have seen but you have not observed kind of thing. And and there's just lots of stuff like that in this movie. And then, another line I really like is it's put as, like, a post-credits scene, but Toko walking away from the suicide site where Fujo and saying, basically she just wasn't able to fly today. As, like, that's kind of like the note you are left on. There's just a this story, the first movie specifically, is all about suicide, and it has which is a very touchy subject for very good reasons. But I think it has such a like smart and kind of like reasonable approach to it, that like it's not harsh in the way it treats it. It's not like shutting down the way that people feel or their like perspectives, which is like, as someone who as a teacher, you have to go through like mandatory training about that kind of stuff, in terms of like talking to people who might be suicidal. And it is like, you need to be open and like honest and comfortable about it. You cannot be harsh and strict and like, it is like suicide is just wrong and you're a bad person for thinking about it is not the thing to say to someone who is feeling suicidal, right? And the way that this movie approaches it feels so like powerful because it's very smart about its perspective.
Yeah, American media is holistically terrible at talking about suicide. Like, we typically go to one of two extremes, which is what you're talking about, the like demonization or the romanticization, which is something like that terrible, awful Netflix series, 13 Reasons Why, right? Mm-hmm. And those are kind of the two extremes. I will say I've seen the best depictions of like these ideas I've seen tend to be in anime. I would put this in here as well, just being much more open, and not just anime, I would say Japanese media more broadly, because there is more of an openness, I think, to talking about it.
Yeah. And I just think it's a powerful story, this first movie in the way that it approaches it.
Because it's not actually about characters committing suicide is what's interesting. These are people being manipulated into it, right? It's a ghost story. And then the ghost girl at the end does it. But of course, the line between like life and death for her is already blurred. What it's actually, and we get there very fast. One of the first lines in the movie when we meet Toko is Toko like reasoning like, well, it's not actually suicide because none of them left notes, right? Mm-hmm. And so none of them were, blah, blah, blah. And so we take that away, and what it's actually about is Toko, Kokuto, and Shiki all encountering the idea of suicide and thinking about it as an idea, and coming to their own conclusions on it. And I think that's a really interesting way of framing it.
Yeah. And you're right. Like, one of the powerful things about it is like at its center is it's actually a ghost story, which the movie emphasizes even more, because that whole middle scene, that's kind of your middle action scene, that's the thing they added to the movie to like give it another action scene where Shiki goes into the apartment and encounters the ghost and cuts off her own prosthetic arm. Like, I don't even think in the book that at this point she has a prosthetic arm, that we will find out why she has that arm in a later story. I don't even think that's really hinted at yet in the book version, but it's a smart inclusion here that when you get the rest of the timeline, it will make sense how all that stuff kind of pans together, and where Fujo got her powers. There's like little hints, you get like a larger narrative going on here. But that, like, the ghostliness and the spectral nature of what's happening here, I think is very effective. And I particularly find really striking the concept that Shiki sees the first time she encounters the building after there's been a couple of suicides. she sees at the rooftop of the building, like, the one main ghost that we later find out is this Fujio character in the hospital, and 8 ghosts around her, because all the high school girls who will later jump off or commit suicide or be killed, however you want to frame it, like, their ghosts are already there. Like, they're already captured. Their deaths are inevitable. That is almost like set in stone in this weird way. And Toko has this whole speech about how, this like weird dilapidated building from like the economic boom or whatever, and nothing's happening there. And it like is out of sync with time. And it's a very like Nasu, to me, concept of where like there's a lot of like collective unconscious kind of stuff in his fantasy, the fantasy elements you get in his stuff, that is like the way that reality is perceived like changes the reality of things. And so it's like, this is just this weird place, this liminal place that had this purpose, that was made for this thing, and has been left here to rot, and it has put it out of sync with everything else. And there's no, you don't get like a big lore dump about the literal spectral mechanics of what is happening here or something. It's not interested in giving you all that detail. It's more evocative of this place and this weird phenomena that exists, and it's all about the edges of society where bizarre and grotesque things can occur. And that's the kind of fantasy, all of his stories are set in the contemporary time of which it's written, which, because of how the weird process of the stages of which this story was originally released, means it's almost kind of a period piece now, because it was written in 1998. But these movies are coming out in like 2007. But right, all of his stuff is set, like Fate Stay Night came out in winter 2004. It is set in winter 2004. And so it's always meant to be about these weird liminal grotesque areas on the edges of your society. That is where these fantastical things can occur, and reality becomes out of sync with like the strict reality that you think you know. And that whole concept to me is very powerful and evocative in this first movie.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing I wanted to ask about or talk about here is the sheer emptiness of the world in this first movie. Mm-hmm. Is really interesting because it's not that way in the second film. In the second film, they're in the normal world, and it's recognizably normal because they're on buses and trains, and they're in school, and there are other people populating the world. And there are places that are weirder and more remote, like where Shiki lives, but you understand why it's more remote because she lives at the edge of a bamboo forest, right? Out sort of in the sticks and that sort of thing. But in this first one, like, if you told me, like, hey, spoiler, Jonathan, you're going to find out that they're all dead and this is purgatory that they're in this first movie, I would believe you, because it is so eerily empty, the streets and everything. And I'm not, and again, don't spoil it for me, but I'm very curious because it's unclear to me how much of that is a stylistic choice, how much of that is a plot thing going on. It's interesting to me, but it's something I kept noticing is in the same way that I kind of would in like early episodes of Neon Genesis Evangelion, which, as you said, was an influence on the author here. And I think this ultimately becomes a problem with Evangelion because I think it becomes a hole in the world building, how empty the world that they're supposed to be protecting is. Whereas in this one, I did find it interesting, and I kind of want to know more about why these streets are so empty and nowhere they go has other people in it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say it's not like there's no plot thing there. I think it's part of the mood, and it's part of the tone, right. And it's part of that liminal, right? It's a reflection of the world that Shiki lives in and what she sees in her experiences. And I think that's one of the contrasts you get, right? Specifically with the movies, is that this first movie, you are with Shiki almost the whole way through. And all the scenes that you're with, like Kokuto or Toko, are scenes where you see lots of other people, right? Like the scene near the end with Kokuto and Shiki waiting by while the train's going by and they're having the suicide conversation. Right. They're surrounded by people. But I think that the nighttime city that Shiki sees is empty because it's because she needs to be alone. She needs to be empty, right? I mean, it's the title of the thing is on the boundary of emptiness or on the boundary of nothingness. And that's like the space that she is craving, I think. And it's like the world that she is either wants to exist in or has to exist in or is existing in, whether she wants to or not. But it is, I think, a reflection of all of those things and the weird boundaries of the liminal societies that she exists in, the liminal spaces that she exists in.
Yeah. A couple other notes about this first movie. The ending song. I know all the ending songs are by this group, Kalafina. Maybe you can tell us about that. But this first one, Oblivious, is an incredible banger. I was listening to it again this morning. Jesus, that's a great song.
Yeah. Let's talk about the music a little bit just in general, because if you're talking about Oblivious and Kalafina, you have to talk about all the music because it is just an extension of the music. Because this is a name that if you've been listening to our podcast for a while, you should be familiar with, which is Kazuya Yuki. Who she is a composer and songwriter who I think we first encountered in Gundam Seed because she did a bunch of the insert songs for Gundam Seed under the Fiction Junction band name. It's like a project where she is like the songwriter and the composer, and then she works with different singers that actually performed the song, and then it's under Fiction Junction whoever the singer name is. Yuka, I think, is the one who did Annari Isho Datta no ni, or Although We Were Always Together, the classic first ending song to Gundam Seed. Fiction Junction Lisa is the name of the band that did the first ending song to the first season of Kimetsu no Yaiba, which is because Lisa sings it, and so it's Fiction Junction Lisa. So that's Kazuya Yuki, composed and wrote those songs. And then she's also worked as a composer in lots and lots of different anime. Notably, she's one of the two composers that works on Kimetsu no Yaiba. They have two composers that work on that. And then she has also done the Dot Hack series was one of her big things she did. That was one of her first big projects. She did these movies. She then went on to do some things you might have heard of, like Madoka Magica. She did the music for that series. She did the music for Fate Zero. There's a different composer, although someone who's also very good, that did Unlimited Blade Works, but then she came back for Heaven's Feel. So we'll get her music in Fate Zero and Heaven's Feel.
Almost everything we're talking about this season is Yuki Kajiura, which is good because, Jesus, it's good.
Yeah, it's very, very good. And then also Sword Art Online is also her, which I think that is actually the reason why she didn't do Unlimited Blade Works, is because she was doing a bunch of Sword Art Online music. I think is
how does she have time to do all of this? Jesus, I'm looking at Sword Art Online alone is a full-time fucking job. They make a lot of that show.
Yes.
But there's a lot of ones on here that's wow,
Yeah, so she's just an incredible composer. But her stuff for Kata no Kyoukai is and has always been my favorite stuff she's done. Although her Heaven's Feel fucking soundtracks are also incredibly good. But yeah, her music for these movies is just incredible. And you particularly get a lot of it really good in the first two movies, because the first two movies introduce the two major themes in the whole series. You have the main theme, which is the theme that plays for this movie over the opening credits, which is such a gorgeous sequence that you later learn is depicting this dream that Kokuto describes of him being a dragonfly, or looking at the dragonfly, or some dragonfly with the butterfly that isn't really flying and is just floating and falls to the ground, and he can't stop and help it, right? And you get this weird sort of psychedelic almost presentation of that dream-like space with this beautiful haunting music that is kind of main theme. You get an action version of it at the end of the first movie. And then you also get this kind of wistful, nostalgic theme that plays for the main thing for the second movie, which to me is the kind of school theme or something that is these sort of wistful, long past days kind of quality to it. But the whole scores are amazing. They're available on everything like Spotify and Apple Music and stuff. And the scores are put together really well. The first movie has it's a 12-minute suite just called Thanatos that is so good to listen to. But one of the other major
I just added it to my library on Apple Music because I'm getting more and more used to, because even 2 or 3 years ago you could not find anime music on these kind of sites, and now it's so easy. I'm all my fucking torrenting muscles are atrophying in getting anime music. It's great.
Yes, it is amazing that you can just get that stuff and you don't have to jump through 1,000 hoops to do it. But the other big thing she did for these movies is that she formed a band called Kalafina. That is the band no longer exists, partially because there's a lot of record label stuff that went on, but it was active from 2007 to 2019, so for 12 years. It was mainly a group that had 3 different singers. Eventually one of the singers changed or whatever when some of the record label stuff happened, but 3 female vocalists that are kind of the core of the music, and it's got that very distinct Kazuya Yuki style where it's very haunting, and it's I feel her music always makes me envision foggy streets and big like kind of cavernous areas, and particularly the soundtrack here does that, and the Calafina's music with these these layered music, like female vocal harmonies and stuff. And their first big single was Oblivious, which is the ending credits theme for the first movie, which is particularly good. There's a bunch of other good Calafina songs we'll hit as well. But like that's to be such a cool thing that's like you're both the composer for the like normal music that plays in this, and then you also made a literal band that then does all of the different like lyrical songs for the ending credits for the movies. And then that band was so successful on its own that it then went on to put out like albums that were not connected to any shows, and also doing themes for other shows. Like we will get them with, they do a Fate Zero song, they do a Fate Stay Night Unlimited Blade Works song. So it's like we will continue to get Calafina. But it's like a killer band, lots of great music, and it's just, there's nothing that sounds like it. It's such a unique sound. And it fits the tone of Kano no Kyoukai like a fucking glove. Like if you could distill the style and mood of Nasu's writing into music, like scientifically, it would be this soundtrack to me. It fits everything so perfectly, particularly that main theme that plays. It's great. It's one of my favorite anime soundtracks.
It's my favorite thing about the show so far. And that's not an insult to anything else going on in this work. It's just the music is that fucking good.
Yeah.
And, you talked about way back when we reviewed the Kimetsu no Yaiba movie, Mugen Train. That movie ends with Homura, which is this amazing song by Lisa. But, of course, same composer working on that movie, and they do the thing where they build up to Homura. You hear parts of the music before you hear the song at the end of the movie, right? And you told me back then, like, yeah, and that's a thing Ufotable's done forever. And you fucking meant it, because the first Garden of Sinners does that. There are pieces of Oblivious, or Oblivious is building off of, like, there's this kind of, like, eerie choral thing going on in the movie that then I feel like just screams into life with Oblivious, which is just this, like, not that the singing is guttural, but there's something about it that's just like, it feels like it bursts out of the heart of the unconscious of the movie at the end of it, and it's just so clearly an extension of the music we've heard so far. And in a very different way, the second song is much more, sort of a ballad kind of thing, but similar quality to that. And so yeah, it seems like you're absolutely right, Sean. That is a fucking Ufotable signature with their movies, and I love it.
Yeah, I mean, they work with a lot of the same composers and the same artists. Like, I mean, we'll get to like Lisa's like first big hit in Fate Zero. It's weird. Like in many ways, the modern anime song industry, I feel like, kind of comes out of the Ufotable type moon stuff in some weird way. And also just to be very like clear, that Homura comparison is very exact, because just to be very clear, like she composed Homura, Kazuya Yuki. Like she's the one who wrote the music. I believe that Lisa wrote the lyrics. But like it's she. And this is a common thing. We'll get it for my favorite version of this is when we get to the Heaven's Feel movies. What they do with those three movies is fucking amazing. But this is a continuing thing that we will hit, and it's like very special. I wish more movies did this. I wish more movies like went out of the way to have the ending credits song be this like culmination of the soundtrack of the whole movie, whereas like usually you get like in whether it's Japanese movies or English movies, like, hey, we got this like pop song from this big group or something that will just play over the beginning of the credits or something, which can sometimes be fun, but it's really powerful when you sit there and watch the whole credits, not because you're waiting for a post-credit scene, which, to be fair, there are ones here because it is structured like an anime episode, but you want to sit there and watch the whole credits because it feels like it's an integrated part of the whole experience of the movie because of the music purely, and because the song spans the entire length of the credits as well. Yeah.
I mean, the usual, and again, it's not just anime, but anime obviously has made a giant industry out of this. The usual, strategy here is that you are trying to make a hit single, right? So you're going to get a band, and you're usually a hot band, and maybe they have a new song they already wrote, or they can write one for your movie, and often you'll get a bunch of great music out of that, and we all love it. But there is something to the Ufotable method of, it's just as much a part of the production as anything going on in the animation or the voice acting or anything. And the upside of that is then they also get hit singles out of it because they're amazing songs. So there is a method to the madness, not just artistically. It also works from a business sense.
Yeah, like in this case, it launched a band that lasted for 12 years and released like 6 studio albums. You know, like it's pretty, like that's a pretty crazy. You know, obviously that is a huge outlier, but it's like a pretty crazy thing to happen as part of the production of these movies. It's like, oh, we made a very successful J-pop. I don't know what genre you give it. Let's just call it J-pop band.
They're a girl group.
Yes, and it's the the Spice Girls. Like here's Calafina. It's the same genre for sure.
I don't know if I can think of 2 more different bands.
Yes.
But I do like the comparison. Yes. Calafina and the Spice Girls, peas in a pod. Anything else to say about Overlooking View before we move on to the next movie?
2 thumbs up. It's a good movie.
It's a great movie. Yeah. And I'm sure I will think even better of it later. But yeah, I can't praise the musical turn you get into Oblivious at the end enough, because if I wasn't already on board, and I very much enjoyed this, but there's something about that kick into Oblivious at the end that's like, okay, I'm in this. This is I'm very excited to see what's next. And what's next is A Study in Murder Part 1. I've also seen this translated as Murder Speculation Part 1. I kind of like the name Murder Speculation. I don't know if you have a preference.
Yeah, I like A Study in Murder. I think A Study in Murder is the like what Nasu's English title for it is supposed to be, because I think it is meant to be a Sherlock Holmes reference because he's a big mystery buff. Yes, but whatever.
So the show is on Crunchyroll at the time we're recording this. I don't know if it still is by the time this is coming out, but they're using these slightly different titles that seem like they're just alternate translations, not the official original titles, which, A Study in Murder is where you'll usually see it online.
Yes, but this is part 1 or Zenpen, like beginning part, end part is how it's like literally labeled in Japanese, rather than part 1, part 2. Which I like more because
for like before you'll see like oh, that's the kanji for like Mae. Yeah,
that's the same way that like the books are technically released in separate volumes, but it's not like, oh, this is volume 1, 2, 3. This is like the beginning, middle, end volume is basically how it's labeled, which I like more because it doesn't imply that there would be more than 2 parts. But anyways, this is a 2-part story of the 7-part movie series, and this is the 2nd movie, and part 2 is the 7th movie. But that's also not so straightforward as like, that is not to say that the 7th movie is necessarily just you find out what happens after the end of this cut, and it just continues linearly from that fashion. This movie series is not so simple as that. But this is your beginning of the story, right? We go, as I said earlier, you get this very wistful piece of music here that I love, that to me like tells almost like the whole story of the movie in some ways, without maybe all the murder bits, but that like the school life, it feels so intentionally, even though it is not necessarily framed within the context of the movie, of Kokuto looking back on this, it feels like someone remembering their high school days, how you're experiencing the story. I guess he is kind of narrating over it, which maybe gives it a little bit of that feel, but it's more just the tone, the emotion, the space, the way that like time, you get basically a whole year passes by, right? It opens in the winter and him seeing Shiki on this like the classic anime road that is on like a hill that overlooks the town that someone looks wistfully over, that is in every anime, because I assume it's in every Japanese town. That's just my, I don't know if that's true, that's just my assumption. And it starts there and then it ends in winter, with that same person now trying to slit the throat of the person that was looking at them. What a journey we have gone on over the course of the hour of this movie.
Truly a universal high school experience. You remember when I did that to you, Sean?
Yeah,
at the end of our sophomore year, holding the knife to your throat. I don't even remember how it resolved. It cut really, abruptly after we did that.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, that was very sudden. I was surprised that they didn't expel you for that. Like, I thought that's how that would go, but it's like, just like sometimes the school admin's soft on some stuff.
It was off school property.
Yeah. But anyways, yeah, like there's just a nostalgic quality to this second movie that I found very powerful, right? It's a different kind of tone than the first movie. The first movie is so cold and like heavy and kind of oppressive and lonely. And this one has, this powerful nostalgia to it that is punctuated very sharply, repeatedly with this like powerful darkness where there is a serial killer that is progressive, like mangling people in progressively more grotesque ways as it goes on, which is described in excruciating detail in the book. And it's almost less gory somehow in the movie than I feel like it was reading the book. But it's very violent. And there's something about the juxtaposition of those two things, this like powerful nostalgia and melancholy for this like high school crush. And then also maybe my high school crush was possibly a serial killer that was mangling the corpses. I don't know. And that's a really interesting space for this story to exist in.
Yeah, if you cut out the murder, this is an anime you've seen before.
Yes.
Right? This is very much it's the, transfer. I guess she's not literally a transfer student, but feels like the transfer student. And then there's the boy who's like our POV and gets infatuated with her, but she's a little standoffish. But eventually, they're going to consummate it at the end. In this case, that does all happen. It just involves murder, and the consummation is a knife to the throat.
Yes. And that also the person you're infatuated with has like a double personality and
Yes.
lives in a weird mansion in like not like Japanese mansion, like mansion in
A
the
traditional
woods.
mansion, a castle, basically, a small
Yes.
like Japanese cat, like a shogun's like lair kind of
Yeah,
thing.
where she does sword fit like practice, like traditional like kenjutsu practice with her father with actual swords. Like not this is no wooden swords here. These are actual like metal sharp blades. Like the little bit you get the insight into some of like Shiki's life here is so like shocking and like startling and weird. She could not have a more different fucking life than Kokuto. And that like slow unpeeling back of, certainly we do not know everything about Shiki over the course of the story, but you start getting to learn more about this person and where she comes from and her weird psychology. And again, like as the story goes on, that and more of that happens, and the killings become more extreme and more frequent, and like everything starts to like twist and distort. And one of the great tricks of the music is that you go from that wistful piece to at the end of the movie, it turns into this distorted, weird version of the main theme you heard in the previous film. That is where like, oh, this is the Shiki film. This is like where it becomes that. And that's like a powerful musical trick you get that helps you kind of tell that story as well. But it's such a cool story. I just had a very fun time watching the second one last night, especially because I know where everything goes, and seeing like how it's all set up and the contrasts you get in this first movie are really cool to me.
Yeah, I'm guessing, my reaction to a lot of these will be, boy, I would like to rewatch this when I know more. Mm-hmm. This one, like I will say, on first viewing, I didn't, quote unquote, like this one as much as the first movie. I found it roughly as interesting because it's a very interesting plot with a lot going on. This one, I think, just as its own hour of movie, less satisfying because it does not have a resolution, and a lot of it is... I struggle to say it's setup because it is, but also it's such artful, weird, like eerie setup that I feel like that's cutting it short a little bit, or not it's giving it short shrift a little bit. But it is essentially, it is introducing these characters and doing some sort of like beginning exposition of kind of who they are in their relationship. And it's not, I don't think, maybe as juicy as what you get in that first movie, especially because the atmosphere in that first one is just so thick and memorable. Mm-hmm. And this one has other things going on while it does still have a very memorable atmosphere and all of that. It's still excellent, and it's still, like I said, I wanted nothing more than to continue watching at the end of the night, but then like that would ruin the podcast project if I just spoiled myself, so had to stop. But I did enjoy it a lot, and again, like the spin on a very sort of classic anime trope into, but the person has dual personalities, comes from this weird family. It's not even just the, again, story we've seen a million times, the like person from the rich family. This is like Kaguya-sama or something, right? But it's like, what if Kaguya-sama came from a rich family that literally lived like they were in feudal Japan, and she had to fight with swords, and she has multiple personalities, and if she's not murdering people, she is at the very least using their blood as lipstick and like bathing in the moonlight in a blood shower from a person's severed neck. It's pretty fucked up. It's very memorable. It's very interesting. And, the driving mystery of this episode really isn't even who's doing the murders. Because to all visual evidence, it's just Shiki. It's not much of a mystery. The mystery of this is, why is Kokuto so interested in her? And I think that's a really interesting question here, because that is something that is completely left to the viewer, and that is where I think the action of this episode as a piece of art really lies, is what is going on between these two people? Why is he so invested in this person who every possible warning sign is telling him to run away, including her with her weird alternate personality that's all uppercase Shiki, telling him to get away.
Yes. Like, to be clear with that, like the shiki thing, it is stylized in English as all uppercase. Of course, in Japanese, what it is it's two different kanji that can be read as shiki. So, like, let's call
There's no such thing as uppercase, lowercase in Japanese, to be clear. Yeah.
So, like, let's call her the female shiki, the watashi shiki. That is the kanji that could be read as, like, ceremony. And then the male shiki is the one, the ore shiki, is the one that is written with the kanji for, like, to weave something. And so, yes, so it is two different kanji that can be read as shiki. And the relationship between the two different personalities is, like, a big thing in the movie that is, I think, like, very complex and hard to untangle, partially because we don't have all the pieces to that puzzle yet. But I find it very... It's because it's more than just like, oh, this is like a male personality, female personality. It's like, as you get with, like, on one of the bodies, there's a yin-yang symbol carved into one of the bodies. There's, like, a yin-yang quality. There's, like, a good, evil, that which accepts and that which denies, that which kills and that which is killed, that is played between the two personalities, which is where you get another one of those just, like, very Nasu, very striking, like, sequences at the end of the movie in terms of, like, lines where Kokuto talks about that the reason why he believes her is because she always is killing herself in a metaphysical sense. She knows better than anyone the pain and sorrow and loneliness that comes with murder, and that is why she could not murder someone, or that is his belief. And I like that concept that she has these two battling identities, and one of those identities needs to continuously repress that other identity, and that repression takes the form of a symbolic murder. And that is where both her, like, fascination to, and potentially, like, her, like, inability to kill, like, her, like, this push and pull between what she wants and what she needs to do, what she cannot do, relating to these two personalities that are in conflict within her. And her relationship with Kokuto seems to push them into further conflict, right? That's what the Ore Shiki tells Kokuto the first time that personality comes out, is that they're getting out of sync, and it becomes more out of sync the closer that she and Kokuto become. And that's, like, part of, like, the weird dynamic of their relationship.
Yeah. But I really do, as much as I agree with all of that, and Shiki is very interesting here for all those reasons and more, there is something about, like, well, okay, who is more fucked up? Is it the person potentially killing people and bathing in their blood, or is it the person watching them and going, man, I gotta be that person's friend, and potentially more, right? Like, there is almost a quality to this of the only possible analog I have is the TV show Hannibal, of, like, there's something about the, like, grisliness of murder, but done in this kind of tableau visual style where it is heightened beyond what dead bodies could ever possibly actually look like in reality, and there is this sort of capital R romantic quality to it. Romantic as in, like, romanticism, the, like, artistic genre between these two. And there's this strange infatuation between these figures that substantially involves murder and dismemberment and these sorts of things. This is not similar to Hannibal in a million ways, but, like, that is one way where I'm like, there's some kind of thematic overlap that's the only, like, analog I can quite draw here.
Yeah, like, I think one of the things that Nasu does with Kokuto is that he takes what I think is, like, a pretty stock anime character, which is the sort of, like, seemingly infinitely compassionate, open-minded protagonist of, like, a romance show or something, that like whatever happens, like he's still able to like find it in him to believe in people and all that kind of stuff. And he pushes that characterization to the point where it feels like uncomfortable, where there's like almost something wrong with someone that is so compassionate, like to be so willing to go that far for someone. Like there's something almost disturbing about it. And this is a concept that I think we'll revisit with some of the stuff in Fate as well, because it's a recurring character archetype that Nasu likes, is pushing these like stock characters to extreme places. And I think kind of like making you reevaluate some of those like generic virtues that you kind of take for granted in protagonist characters and character writing and stuff. And yeah, there's something about Kokuto here that is like off, that goes so far, and he seems to, until like the actual knife comes out and he sees he has been cut, he seems to have no concept of like, you are at risk here. Like your life is at risk. And he's like not really considering that at all in a way that feels almost like psychopathic or something.
Absolutely. Because there is the philosophical, like, gymnastics he does to get to the point of like, well, you have two personalities and you described it earlier of like, one of them is always dying and being killed, and so you can't kill. That's an interesting like philosophical logic. It's an absurd logic when you're trying to get close to a person who's bathing in another person's blood, right? Like that's, that is you are justifying something in yourself as much as you are justifying something in them, coming up with that explanation. And that's what I think is interesting here, because you're right. It's not just a stock character. It's a stock character I will often find kind of annoying, because it can be the like author insert who wants to get close to the interesting girl. It's often a boy, and like it can be, there are good versions of it. It can also be a little insufferable in some cases. And I think what they're playing with here is the turning it up to 11 that makes it so interesting. Yeah.
And I like that, you've got his buddy Gakuto, who's like the big jock looking dude. I love the conversation between the two of them where Gakuto's just like, what the fuck is wrong with you, man? And there's a really good line where he's like, man, like if you can't see how crazy she is, like that means you must be in love with her. Like that's the only way you could possibly not be so blinded about what's going on with her, because she is like legitimately fucking terrifying.
Yes, indeed. This is also where we get the whole thing where throughout this whole episode, Shiki is wearing a like traditional kimono, even as it becomes like unseasonable for wearing a traditional kimono. And Kokuto has the whole line about, maybe you'll wear a jacket over it, and suggests a leather jacket almost as a joke. And then Shiki basically feels like as a fuck you, gets the big cool red leather jacket and starts wearing it over the kimono, thus birthing one of the most iconic looks in the history of anime. And I love it.
Yeah, I love that conversation so much. It is word for word the scene from the books. It's so good, of just like, because I do think it's very much like, yeah, fuck you. Yeah, I will get a leather jacket. Is basically, I think, what her mindset is. Because yeah, it's one of the things I love about Shiki. That she is a character that exists on a boundary. Right, the title of the show is On the Boundary of Nothingness. And she is. And she has like the multiple personalities, so she's on like that boundary, and then it's like represented also with her clothing, that she has the kimono, which is this traditional Japanese clothing that you normally would not wear, particularly in the city, in like a day-to-day setting, is like very weird. But then combining that with this like big red leather jacket is this like bizarre mishmash of two different styles of like historical Japan and modern day Japan, that just like it's such a striking character design, because it both looks really cool, particularly with her standard kind of blue kimono with the red jacket, but it also I think evokes something really powerful about the character existing between these two spaces.
Right. Well, and it is also masculine and feminine combined.
Yes.
Right? Mm-hmm. Because the kimono, this is a feminine kimono. You would not see a guy wearing this. And the jacket, a woman, there's no reason a woman couldn't, but it is clearly a more masculine coded piece of fashion. Yeah. And then you put them together, and so you have this flowing dress and then this leather jacket up top. And so just literally on all parts of her body is this sort of androgyny. And I mean, this episode comments on that a lot. There's this really interesting scene after she comes in from doing the kendo training with the swords and her dad. and and that's where you have the conversation where she's talking to like her servant about like, I will never actually, this is ridiculous, I will never be inherited, I'm a girl, they will not pass the family line onto a girl. And she says, and the servant is talking about like, well, but you're so much stronger than your brother.
I think he says like the brother has not inherited what you have inherited. What you are is not like your brother didn't have the things that you have.
Right. And then Shiki goes inside and undresses, and we literally see most of her body naked, very androgynous, with like the breasts bound for the training, which gives her a flat chest. And again, playing with that sort of visual androgyny and, to a certain degree, obviously, echoing transgenderism and all sorts of things. Yeah.
But you also get something interesting here where, you then start having the two personalities, which again are coded as male and female. And you get that very clearly through both like the modulation of the voice that Sakamoto Maya does, as well as the manner of speech. One speaks masculine, one speaks feminine. But I think one thing that's interesting, just looking at the two movies we have, is that you've got masculine Shiki in movie 2 is the one who's very like effusive and energetic and is like, that's the one that when it goes on the date with Kokuto and is like, hey man, Kokuto, like, let's go, like, let's hang out, let's do this whole thing. And like they're old pals, in this, and again, in a very like masculine coded way. It's not a romantic date. It doesn't feel like a romantic date. It feels like two high school, like male buddies, like hanging out at the mall and getting a burger, basically. And there's just an effusive, positive quality to that male Shiki. But that is like very, very different than the also male coded in terms of the speech pattern Shiki you get in the first movie that like has the vocal patterns in terms of the manner of speech of this past male Shiki, but is much more sort of cold and dark and like repressed and sort of stern and stoic in her manner of speech, which is the exact opposite of what you see this like high school era male Shiki. And I think, again, this is stuff that you'll see more of. I think when you look at those two, like, it makes you wonder, like, what is the thing that happens at the end of this movie that leads you to that point? Like, what happens to this person? How do these multiple personalities come into play? Because the Shiki you see in that first movie isn't exactly either the personalities you see here.
Right. And of course, this movie ends on a very pointed, intentional cliffhanger with the knife to the neck. Unclear what's going to happen. Seems like Shiki is hesitating, but seems like another part of Shiki wants to do it. And then we cut to black, we hear tires screech, and then we go forward to just before the first movie. So like a couple months earlier in 1998. I think the first film is September, and then we're in June. And it is Kokuto going to the hospital, which he apparently goes to every week. Everyone there knows him. And he's got flowers, and he's going to visit Shiki, who is in some kind of coma or something, right? And so, Sean, I know you know what's going on here. I don't know. And I guess, my guess from like the implication of the tire screech sound is that she gets hit by a car and possibly loses an arm. And we'll revisit that. And there's a coma thing going on here. And maybe nobody has resolved the whole murder case in the meantime because she's been in a coma. I don't know. But that's the general implication. I'm very curious when we will find out answers to these things, because the part 1, part 2 nature of this title makes me think it could be a while.
Yes, I don't remember, because you will, for some of those questions, you will not have to wait all the way till part 7, because you again, we bounce around in the timeline, but yes, who knows? There are things that happen that clearly have caused Shiki to be in this coma, and all that kind of stuff. Because there's also, there's just there's a lot of stuff we do not know yet about what's going on here. But one thing we can point out that I really like in that scene at the end, the whole scene at the end of the movie with Shiki dancing in the bamboo forest with the knife cutting at Kokuto is very interesting to me. There's something about the way that's framed where she's wearing this blood red kimono that is not blood red because it's covered in blood, but it's just she has a red kimono, and you don't really see her face because her hair is wet and matted over her, and she pulls out the knife and she's almost drunk or something in her movements, right? And Kokuto's confused and then slowly realizes like, oh fuck, I'm actually going to get killed. Like this is like, I'm going to die here, and runs away for his life and has that realization. And then he gets pinned to the ground, and she says, like, Kokuto, 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 is there anything you want to say? And he says, I don't want to die. And then this is such a good line where she says, but the thing is, Kokuto, I want to kill you. And that's when it cuts to black. And it's like, that's such a good line. There's something about, like, the pacing of that dialogue, that back and forth. And so the way Sakamoto Maya plays that line, that you, like, there's so much emotion and so many layered emotions, it's really hard to tease out, like, what is she feeling as she says that? I think is, like, really hard to pin down because there's so much happening there. It's a really great moment.
Oh, it's fantastic. And something we have not yet talked about is how fucking good the character animation in these is. Mm-hmm. I mean, all the animation is, but when character animation, I just mean the basic, movements of the characters. It's not like every single scene is ludicrously fluid. Sometimes it's fairly standard anime motion, which is fine. But when they want to go for it, there's a level of nuance to it that is incredible. The scene that honestly is probably my favorite scene in the first episode is just Shiki alone in her apartment eating the ice cream. Yes. Because it is, I haven't seen another scene like that in anime. That is very much a kind of like live action indie movie thing. There's like, there's a movie by David Lowery called A Ghost Story that came out a couple years ago that I love, where there's one scene where Rooney Mara's character, her husband has just died, and it's just like a 9-minute long take of her sitting on the ground eating a pie because she's having grief, and it's amazing. I think of like movies like Tsai Ming Liang, the Taiwanese filmmaker will do stuff like this of just ludicrously long takes of someone eating or drinking or something like that. And this is sort of the animation equivalent of that. Of course, the difference when it's animation is that you can't just point a camera, tell the actor to do their thing, and shoot, which is the magic of that kind of thing in live action. Here you have to animate the detail of it. And so, of course, it's not a 9-minute take because the amount of effort to do that animation would be ludicrous. But it's a couple minutes, and it's incredible just the amount of, like, little nuanced detail and, like, acting and performance of the character you get in that scene. And then, the action is obviously very fluid in that episode and everything. But then when you get to the end of this one, what you're talking about with her, like, drunk on murder or whatever and, like, flying around with the knife, it looks eerie. It looks wrong. It looks like a level of like motion that feels like it's breaking the rules of anime, of like how this animated world should look. And that's what it's so effectively eerie because of that.
Yeah. And just also that, like, that bamboo forest that separates Shiki's house from like the rest of the world is such a good location. It's so striking. You talked earlier about the POV shot you get of it. You have, I think what my favorite shot in the second movie is the one where it's when Kokuto stumbles upon the murder in the bamboo forest with the guy who's had his fucking head chopped off and is just spewing blood in the air. But it starts with this shot of just looking down at like the cobble road, and it just holds on that shot for like a minute, and then slowly blood trickles in the crevices between like the pieces of rock that the road is paved with, and then that comes down into the frame, and then the camera slowly pans up as you see like, oh, the blood has like, it's like this really long road up to that end where blood has seeped into the crevices between the rocks all the way down the pathway, creating this weird blood-lined road basically to Shiki standing in front of the body with the blood spurting. And that slow pan and that image of the blood seeping into the crevices is so good. And that, I think that instinct to hold on that moment for so long is really striking. It's obviously not as much like animation stuff as the ice cream scene, but I think it's a similar like sensibility as the ice cream scene of like let's just really sit in this and build this moment, build until you can like get your either your money shot of the dead body or like Shiki finally being able to actually like get the fucking ice cream into her mouth, Yeah.
No, it's incredible. And yeah, that's probably my favorite scene in this one is just the sheer horror of the blood dripping through the cobblestones, going up and up and up the street until you get the whole reveal of it. Yeah, incredible.
Yeah. You also have the sequence where, near the beginning of the movie where the guy gets hit by a truck and then Shiki stumbles on the body and kneels into the blood, and it like stains her kimono, and she dips her finger in it and then puts it on her lips, which is another, if you're talking about like gender and like the gendered stuff in this, that's a really powerful moment. And that moment stood out to me because I read these chapters a couple of months ago, because I read them before my job started, because I fell off because I've been so busy with work. But when I got to that scene, I got to the word for lipstick with its kuchibeni, which I didn't know, and I didn't know the kanji specifically. And it didn't have the furigana, so it didn't have the reading next to it, and so I had to look it up. So every time I have, and it has done the thing where now I feel like every time I read something in Japanese, I fucking encounter that word again. It's that thing where you learn a new word and then you're seeing it everywhere, and it constantly is making me think of this image. Every time I see the word lipstick written in Japanese, I'm constantly thinking of Shiki like putting blood on her lips, because the line in Japanese is specifically it's that was the first lipstick she ever wore, is the ending of that like section. And it's like such a striking line, and I was like, wait, what the fuck is this? I had to look up like, what did she put? Like, what did she do with the blood? It's like, oh, lipstick. That's fucked up.
I love the idea of like an actual Japanese person, like a native Japanese speaker, their first encounter with the word lipstick being that. Makes me laugh my head off. That seems like that would be impossible, but it would be very funny if that was the case. Yeah,
it's just, weirdly enough, that word didn't come up when I read, say, like Dragon Ball or, Full Metal Alchemist. It's just a lot of that. You're shown in manga type stuff that you read. Lipstick doesn't pop up as a vocab word.
You don't remember the scene in Dragon Ball Z where Goku has died from the Makanko Sappo and Gohan goes up to his corpse and traces the blood as lipstick?
And that was the first lipstick Gohan had ever worn. Next time on Dragon Ball Z, will he powder his face with Piccolo's ashes?
Oh boy, that's we're imagining a very different version of Dragon Ball.
Oh, Jesus. Back to Kinoko Kyoukai. What else about the second movie?
I feel like we covered it. I mean, you talked about the music earlier in this one. Again, it's also gorgeous. It definitely enhances that, I think, nostalgic sense you're talking about that I think is very much there in this one, where it does feel like a memory piece. And of course, chronologically being the second one automatically kind of makes it feel like a memory because you're going back and backfilling things. But yeah, no, it's these two together are a very striking start to the thing, because I don't feel like I have a handle on it yet, but I know I'm very intrigued for what's to come.
Yeah, and I don't think it's coming across in my mind, but it just started raining here, and it made me think of there's a really great scene in the second movie where another one of my favorite scenes is them waiting outside while it's raining at the school.
The umbrella scene, yeah.
Yes, and Kokuto starts humming to himself, and that slowly turns into a song in the soundtrack as she.
It turned into like this jazzy piano track. It was really striking to me, yeah.
Yeah, and Shiki starts listening to it very calmly. It's like the most natural she looks in the whole movie, outside of maybe the scene at the very, very beginning in the snow. And you get these really nice atmospheric shots that are very anime. I love when anime does it. So, let's just have the background. Let's just show the background and show it raining on the background. Here's the school pool. Here's, this garden next to the school. And you just, live in that moment a little bit. And then she gets the flashes of the murders. And it, ruins it. And she starts to Kokuto to stop. Another just very, striking scene that, again, shows the very slow, deliberate pace and style of these movies. We're really willing to sit in those moments for long periods of time.
Absolutely. Yeah. That might actually, now that you're saying it again, and I'm looking at my notes, might be my favorite scene in the episode, because that is, again, just such a purely cinematic moment of this humming that wills into being the score, and the score is very different than anything we've heard. And then we're just looking at, Ufotable has some of the most beautiful backgrounds in the business, and most singular. You can tell an Ufotable background from a mile away. There's something about they're hyper detailed, but they're hyper detailed in a different way than Makoto Shinkai's backgrounds are hyper detailed, which is another one that I think of them as kind of similar but different. It's a great scene. One thing we haven't talked about with either of these yet, Sean, is the claymation skits that open the episodes. Mm-hmm. That are you're in a theater, and it is basically characters from the episode, as claymation people watching the movie. And the first one is an anti-cell phone PSA, and the second one is an anti-piracy PSA with someone taking out their camera. I found that was very funny.
Yes, I wish Ufotable brought that back, because they used to, on a lot of their older stuff, they had these weird claymation shorts that they would do. They should bring it back. Bring back the claymation.
You could have so much fun with that for Kimetsu no Yaiba,
Yes.
given how they do like their next episode previews and stuff. That would be hilarious. I want Mai Zenitsu, as a claymation character.
Yeah, because that's just one of those things about like Ufotable, is that kind of, again, it's the same approach they had with like the 3D stuff, where it's animators of any like style or craft or whatever, like kind of all working together, and so putting in these like claymation bits and bobs, I've always really loved.
Yeah, it's very fun. Because I had no idea what to expect, so it took me a little bit to realize what they were even doing with that first one. That it's a little like PSA prologue to the episode, not the actual episode. Made me laugh very hard.
Very good stuff.
Yeah. All right. Anything else to say about Kara no Kyoukai for now before we break? And next week you're going to hear us talk about parts 3 and 4.
So we talked a lot about Sakamoto Maya as Shiki. We need to shout out Suzumura Kenichi, who plays Kokuto.
Yes.
Obviously not as like dramatic a character, particularly in these first two, although he gets a lot of good stuff in the second movie. He's mostly asleep for the first movie. They cut out most of that character's stuff for the book, which I find very funny. But Suzumura Kenichi, of course, also a great actor, but this is one of those things where, so in real life, Sakamoto Maya and Suzumura Kenichi are married. And
I didn't know that. That's funny.
This is the thing where they are like, these movies were made before they were married, but they're in fucking everything together, and they're always in stuff together, and their characters are always closely related. We've actually mentioned this before, although it was less like sort of significant at the time, because the first thing they were in together was Gundam Seed Destiny. Sakamoto Maya plays Luna Maria Hawk. Suzumura Kenichi plays Sheen from Seed Destiny, the ill-fated Sheen. And so they were in that together. They were then in this together. They are in Final Fantasy VII together, because Sakamoto Maya is Aerith, Suzumura Kenichi is Zax. So like in Crisis Core, with that remake coming out, if you want to see them together in a thing, playing characters that are like the two main characters that are romantically related, you can see that there too. They're in fucking everything. And it is just like, it is one of those weird... It's just one of those weird pairings. That's just like, they go so together so well as actors that then they eventually got married. And I think they had a kid recently too. So it's something I feel compelled to mention every time they come up in a thing. It's like, oh, by the way, it is another thing where these two actors are, for whatever reason, they were cast in this project together, obviously totally separately. Again, it's not like they were married at this point, so there was nothing intentional there. And it's just, they have a lot of good chemistry.
They do, and they're great. And I did not know this until reading through the Wikipedia, that Kenichi Suzumura has been cast as, well, we've heard him a little bit, but this character's barely been in it so far, but Iguro in Kimetsu no Yaiba, and Demon Slayer. Mm-hmm. That is such good casting, knowing where they went. Once we get to the Iguro part of the story, y'all are going to like that. He's going to be very good at that.
Yes. He's a great actor. And again, we will get more, I think, like... showcase scenes for him in later episodes, because he's not in this one, or these ones like that much, or doesn't get the most dramatic material yet compared to Shiki, certainly.
Yeah, but anyway, I'm loving it, Sean. I'm very fascinated for what's to come. I'm excited because, again, I have no basis with any of this stuff. Like you talking about Fate Stay Night being like, people from the past coming into the future, blah, blah, blah. I didn't know that about Fate Stay. I know nothing about any of this stuff. It's just not something I've engaged with before, and I always love that. I love going into things cold with the general assurance that they will be good. And so this season of Japanimation Station is one I'm very excited to go through.
Yeah, I'm very excited because, there's always that risk of where, again, I said, like, with the first Weekly Suit Gundam episode, where I sit down for this podcast, I'm like, oh, God, what if Jonathan fucking hated it? What if, like, for whatever reason, Jonathan just came on and he's like, this is the worst dog shit I've ever seen in my entire life. And it's just like, do we just have to end the podcast?
It would be like, season 2 would be canceled, and we'd have to go record a separate season to replace it. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm glad that you like it a lot, because it's one of those things that I've wanted to be able to talk about this kind of stuff on the podcast for a long time. This has been a very, very fun thing to get to talk about. I do want to give, for listeners, a content warning for the next episode, because the next episode deals with sexual assault quite heavily. Similarly to, we had the first episode is about suicide. The third episode is kind of about sexual assault in a similar kind of thematic perspective. So I think it handles that material very well, but people should go in knowing it handles that material in fairly explicitly as well. And it is a thing that you will also get thematically in some later Fate stuff, particularly in the Heaven's Feel movies. So people should be aware of that going into the third movie, that it is dealing with that subject matter. But again, in my opinion, it does it very well. It's not like a Game of Thrones thing where it throws it off as like shock value. It is what the plot of the next episode is about, but people should know going in that that's what it's about.
Good. I think it's good to provide that warning, because this series so far, not fucking around with what it depicts.
Yeah, now like what the tone and how dark it can get, and so I think it is appropriate material for the show to handle, but that is where it like is dealing with that kind of topic pretty heavily.
All right, well, next time, parts 3 and 4, as we continue our season 2 of Japanimation Station.
Yes, I'm very excited to dig deeper and deeper into the Garden of Sinners.
Japanimation Station.